In the spring of 1943, on training grounds nestled in the Bavarian forest near a town most of the world has never heard of, a military unit began to take shape whose existence would be almost entirely forgotten by history. Not because it played no role in the war that was reshaping Europe, but because its story became entangled with so many others, overshadowed by larger operations and better-known commands, until it seemed to vanish into the archives like breath fading against cold glass. The 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg would spend the next 2 years moving across the continent in a desperate, exhausting retreat, fighting in battles that changed little, losing soldiers whose names were never recorded in any official history book, and ultimately dissolving into the fog of 1945 with barely a whisper of recognition. Yet for those who served in its ranks, for the men who trained in those mist-covered fields and marched into combat carrying the division's insignia, their experience was as vivid, as terrifying, and as utterly real as any soldier's war could ever be. It is perhaps fitting that we should begin our story here, in this quiet place, where morning mist clings to the pine forests and the air carries that particular German dampness of late March, when winter has not quite released its grip, but spring insists on breaking through. Picture, if you will, the vast training grounds at Grafenwöhr, a facility that had been preparing soldiers for decades, a place where the rhythm of military life had settled into a kind of institutional permanence. The barracks buildings stood in neat rows, their architecture functional and spare, painted in that drab field grey that seemed to absorb the mist rather than stand out against it. Beyond the buildings stretched open fields, empty of all but the soft movement of fog rolling across grass that would soon be churned into mud by the boots of 10,000 men. In those fields, on those mornings when the light was still grey and uncertain, the first elements of a division were beginning to coalesce, not yet a unit, but the raw materials from which one would be forged. If you've ever wondered how an entire military formation emerges seemingly from nothing, how thousands of men are gathered, organized, and transformed into a coherent fighting force, then you've likely encountered one of the great puzzles of military history. The process is slow, methodical, and filled with countless small decisions that accumulate into something vast and complex. In 1943, with the war turning against Germany on multiple fronts, the demand for trained soldiers had become almost insatiable, and the Waffen-SS, the military wing of the Nazi Party, was expanding at a remarkable pace. New divisions were being raised at a frequency that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier, and yet the machinery of recruitment, conscription, and training continued to churn forward with grim efficiency. This is the context into which the 10th SS Frundsberg Division would emerge, one of many new formations, one of many attempts to shore up a military structure that was beginning to show cracks both in its organization and in the confidence of those who led it. If you find yourself drawn to these lesser-known stories of the Second World War, to the histories that exist in the margins and shadows of the larger narratives, to the question of how ordinary men experienced extraordinary times, then I'd invite you to subscribe to this channel. We explore the complete histories of the forgotten twin divisions and other understudied Waffen-SS formations, with the kind of careful, patient attention that allows the real human dimensions of these stories to emerge. Each documentary unfolds slowly, designed to be a companion to your own quiet evenings and restless nights, offering detailed historical narrative woven into a pace that allows your mind to settle and your body to find rest. The history is always accurate, always grounded in primary sources and scholarly research, but the rhythm and the tone are shaped entirely around helping you fall gently asleep while learning something substantial and true about the world that was and the people who inhabited it. Now, let us return to those training fields in the spring of 1943 and allow ourselves to sit quietly with the first moments of this division's existence. In the early morning hours before the day's drills would begin, there would have been an almost peaceful quality to the camp. The sound of wind moving through the pines, the occasional call of a bird, the distant bark of a sergeant's voice carried across the fields. These were the acoustic landscape of the Grafenwehr training grounds in those early weeks. The men who had begun to arrive, some in March, more by April, came from many different sources. Some were volunteers, ideologically committed to the cause that the SS represented, products of a decade of propaganda and Nazi youth organizations that had shaped their entire adolescent experience. Others were conscripts, men who had been selected from the Wehrmacht or other organizations and transferred into the SS, some willing, some reluctant, but all of them now part of something that would reshape their lives in ways they could not yet anticipate. What is striking when one examines the personnel records from this period, and they do survive, though in fragmentary form, is the sheer diversity of the men who made up the Frundsberg Division. This was not a unit composed entirely of German citizens in the traditional sense. The Waffen-SS had opened its ranks to ethnic Germans from across Europe, men from the Balkans, from the Baltic states, from Eastern Europe, men whose connection to Germany was through blood and cultural identity rather than through citizenship or long residence. These men arrived speaking different languages, carrying different cultural assumptions, yet all of them were now to be molded into soldiers who would wear the same uniform, obey the same commands, and eventually fight in the same desperate battles. One might wonder, in the quietness of this moment, what thoughts moved through the minds of these young men as they took their first steps on the training ground. Were they apprehensive, eager? Did they have any sense of what lay ahead? Or did they exist in that peculiar state of not knowing that characterizes recruits in any army at any time in history? The mist would clear as the morning advanced, burned away by the sun that moved higher and higher into the sky, and as it cleared, the true scope of the training ground would become visible, vast, empty, waiting. The structures of military organization would begin to impose themselves on the landscape and on the men themselves. Drill sergeants would appear, their voices sharp and cutting through the morning air, calling out commands and corrections. Men would be arranged into formations, into companies and battalions and regiments, their names recorded in ledgers that would eventually accumulate into the regimental records that still exist in archives. Uniforms would be distributed, though perhaps not to everyone, and perhaps not all of the right sizes, for supply was already beginning to show the strain of a war that had consumed more resources than even the most optimistic planners had anticipated. And in all of this mundane activity, the issuing of uniforms, the arrangement of men into units, the beginning of basic training, there was something almost solemn, as though the land itself was holding its breath before a long exhalation that would not end until 1945. Here in these fields, in the cool spring of 1943, with no one yet knowing what the next 2 years would bring, with no sense of which of these men would survive and which would not, the story of the 10th SS Frundsberg Division was just beginning. The mist was clearing, the sun was rising higher, and the machinery of war was preparing to move once again. The names of these men, many of them, would be lost to history. The specific conversations they had, the fears they harbored, the dreams they might have whispered to one another in the darkness of the barracks, all of this would vanish, leaving only the fragmentary records and the slow accumulation of facts that historians piece together into a narrative. Yet in this moment, at the beginning, there was still something pristine about it all, something not yet corrupted by the reality of combat, not yet worn down by the grinding exhaustion of a losing war. This was the threshold, the quiet moment before the doors of history would swing open, and we stand at that threshold now, preparing to walk forward into the detailed and patient telling of what would come next. If the intricate, lesser-examined corridors of the Second World War have begun to interest you, those particular histories where the larger canvas recedes just enough to reveal the texture of a single formation, its men, its struggles, its choices, then you might find value in returning to this channel for future documentaries that explore the Waffen-SS divisions whose stories have remained largely in shadow, overshadowed by the more familiar names that dominate the popular historical record. The 10th SS Frundsberg, which we're tracing together through these hours, represents merely one thread in a far larger tapestry, one division among dozens that merit the kind of careful, deliberate examination that sleep allows us to absorb without the urgency and compartmentalization that waking attention demands. There exists, after all, a particular quality to understanding history in this manner, unhurried, unrushed, permitting the listener to sit with difficult, complex subjects in a state of genuine receptivity rather than the performative intensity that documentary viewing often requires. The formation of the Waffen-SS in the early 1940s produced a cascade of divisions, each with its own organizational structure, recruitment patterns, ethnic composition, and tactical deployment. Many of these formations have been studied in scholarly isolation, confined largely to specialized academic monographs or regimental histories available only in German archives. Yet there remains something illuminating about exploring them in sequence, allowing the patterns to emerge naturally, the ways in which commanders were selected, how training regimens evolved, the manner in which equipment shortages influenced tactical doctrine, how soldiers from different regions and backgrounds were integrated into fighting units bound by ideology, by circumstance, by the sheer momentum of historical events beyond their individual control. The Frundsberg, as you've now begun to understand, was not alone in its experience. It formed alongside the 9th SS Hohenstaufen as a sister formation, a paired organization that would share not only similar training and equipment struggles, but would find themselves, time and again, committed to the same desperate campaigns. And beyond these two, there existed the 11th SS Nordland, the 23rd SS Nederland, the 27th SS Langemark, divisions that recruited from across occupied Europe, from ethnic Germans displaced by the Soviet advance, from volunteers motivated by varying ideologies, from conscripted young men who had little choice in the matter. Each carried its own designation, its own symbolism embedded in chosen names, its own particular human story written across the Eastern Front, across Normandy, across the dying gasps of the Reich itself. Subscribing to this channel opens the possibility of that kind of sustained, methodical exploration. Rather than encountering these formations in scattered references throughout broader narratives of the Second World War, you would have the opportunity to follow individual divisions from their formation through their final collapse, to understand not merely what happened, but how it unfolded day by day, decision by decision, retreat by retreat. The listening experience is designed to accommodate this depth, a pace that permits absorption of complex organizational details, a narrative rhythm that makes room for both the granular specifics of military history and the human dimensions of the soldiers who lived within these structures. This particular approach to historical documentary rests on a simple premise, that the lesser known does not mean the less important, and that understanding the Second World War requires us to venture beyond the conventional focal points. The Frundsberg emerges not as an outlier, but as representative of larger patterns. The hasty expansion of the Waffen-SS, as manpower needs became desperate, the reliance on ethnic Germans pulled from across Eastern Europe as traditional recruitment pools dried up, the gradual degradation of training standards as the demand for fully combat-ready divisions exceeded the capacity of the military infrastructure to supply them. These patterns repeated themselves across multiple formations, each variation slightly different, each story adding texture to the whole. The invitation, then, is to journey further into these histories, to sit with them in the quiet hours, to permit your mind to move through the formation of divisions, the movement of regiments across the vast distances of the Russian steppes, the sudden redeployment to France, the grinding defensive battles that followed, to understand how orders were given and received, how communications broke down, how soldiers endured exhaustion and cold, and the particular terror of knowing that retreat continued even as hope contracted. These are not entertainment narratives designed to stimulate or excite, but rather reflective examinations of historical processes that unfolded across the lived experience of hundreds of thousands of human beings caught within them. And so, as this particular account of the 10th SS Frundsberg unfolds across these hours with you, know that there exists a larger corpus of similar narratives waiting: the 12th SS Hitlerjugend with its youth conscripts, the 2nd SS Das Reich with its pre-war paramilitary origins, the 3rd SS Totenkopf with its dark historical lineage. Each possesses its own formed character, its own sequence of deployments, its own particular tragedy or complexity worthy of patient examination. The channel exists to provide precisely this kind of sustained, documentary-length engagement with the lesser-known dimensions of 20th century history, presented in a manner that accommodates the particular mode of attention that the sleep-listening experience allows, deeper, more sustained, less mediated by the urgencies that daytime consciousness imposes. Return, then, when this account concludes. There will be others waiting, each one ready to guide you through similarly unexamined territories, each one constructed with the same careful attention to detail, the same commitment to accuracy, the same measured pacing that respects both your intelligence and your need for the kind of rest that comes not from distraction, but from engagement with material substantial enough to hold genuine attention. The Frundsberg opens a door. Other divisions wait beyond it. By the early months of 1943, the German military establishment found itself at a peculiar crossroads, one that would shape the entire trajectory of what was to come. The vast Eastern Front, that endless ribbon of snow and suffering stretching across the Soviet landscape, had begun to reveal truths that contradicted the optimism of previous years. The Wehrmacht had stopped advancing. In fact, it had begun, almost imperceptibly at first, to retreat. This shift, quiet but unmistakable, triggered a cascade of decisions within the Nazi regime's military and political apparatus. The Waffen-SS, once a relatively compact elite force, began to expand with unprecedented urgency. New divisions were being raised, not out of ideological fervor alone, but out of something more pressing, a desperate calculation that more soldiers, more formations, more manpower might somehow turn the tide of a war that increasingly appeared to be slipping away. Consider the mathematics of attrition on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union, despite suffering catastrophic losses in the opening years of the war, possessed what no amount of German efficiency could match: inexhaustible human reserves. For every Soviet soldier killed, it seemed, two more emerged from the vast territories of the East. The German army, by contrast, was beginning to feel the weight of its losses accumulate. The Wehrmacht's replacement system, sophisticated though it was, could not quite keep pace with the consumption of men that industrial warfare demanded. Think of it as a bathtub with a widening drain, the water level dropping despite the tap running at full force. The leadership in Berlin understood this dilemma intimately. Heinrich Himmler, who oversaw the Waffen-SS with an almost obsessive attention to detail, saw an opportunity within this crisis. The Waffen-SS had proven itself a capable fighting force, one that could be expanded and deployed flexibly across the theatres of war. Beginning in late 1942 and accelerating through 1943, the decision was made to raise additional divisions. These new formations would not be the carefully selected volunteer units of earlier years. Instead, they would draw upon conscripted personnel, ethnic Germans from occupied territories and allied nations, and men transferred from other military branches. The standards, inevitably, began to soften. Why this particular moment? Why 1943 specifically? The answer lies partly in the grim realities unfolding on the steppes. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended in German defeat just months before. The Sixth Army, once thought invincible, had been surrounded, starved, and finally annihilated. The psychological impact within German command circles cannot be overstated. Stalingrad shattered the myth of inevitable German victory. It suggested that the Soviets could not merely absorb punishment, they could inflict it in overwhelming measure. Compounding this was the realization that Germany faced a truly global war. Although by early 1943, the situation in North Africa was still contested, it was clear that the Western Allies would eventually mount some form of assault on Axis territory. Whether that assault would come against North Africa, Italy, or France remained unclear, but its inevitability seemed certain. The German military planners, aware of these pressures from both East and West, began envisioning a future in which they might need to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously with greater intensity than ever before. The creation of new SS divisions served multiple purposes then. On one level, it was a straightforward military necessity, the need for more combat formations. On another level, it reflected Himmler's growing political ambitions. The Waffen-SS, increasingly, was becoming not merely a military instrument, but something approaching a state within the state, answerable more to Himmler's ideology and vision than to the traditional Wehrmacht hierarchy. More divisions meant more prestige, more independence, more power, concentrated in SS hands. Himmler understood that whoever controlled the armed forces controlled the future of the Nazi regime. This expansion of the SS also carried a demographic component that is worth sitting with for a moment. As the regular Wehrmacht drew from the Reich's German population, the Waffen-SS was increasingly composing itself from ethnic Germans living outside the Reich proper. Romanians, Hungarians, Yugoslavs, Ukrainians, Poles, and others, men who claimed German ancestry or were deemed racially acceptable by Nazi criteria, began filling the ranks of these new divisions. The ideology remained constant. The racial worldview of the Nazi state remained intact, but the actual composition of the fighting force was becoming more variegated, more multinational, more complex than the popular imagination might suggest. The specific manpower crisis was acute enough that the SS organizational structure itself was being fundamentally altered. Where once there had been a careful pyramidal growth of divisions, each fully equipped and thoroughly trained before deployment, the new formations were being raised almost in parallel. Multiple divisions stood up simultaneously in early and mid-1943, sharing equipment, trainers, and commanders. This created logistical nightmares that would haunt these new divisions throughout their existence. There was simply not enough of everything, not enough rifles in some cases, not enough vehicles, not enough experienced junior leaders to pass knowledge down to the newest recruits. The Eastern Front's manpower appetite in these months was truly voracious. The German armies fighting in Russia, even in retreat or in frozen defensive positions, consumed soldiers at a staggering rate. Disease, cold, enemy action, and the general chaos of warfare meant that even stationary units lost personnel constantly. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS required a continuous flow of replacements, merely to maintain their existing strength. Building new formations on top of this demand created a tension that was never quite resolved. What emerges from this historical moment is a picture of a military system under tremendous strain, responding to that strain by expanding itself further, a pattern that, while perhaps seeming logical in the moment, often compounds underlying problems rather than solving them. The decision to raise the 10th SS Frundsberg Division, then, was not made in isolation. It was made within this context of Eastern Front defeats, expanding global conflict, political ambitions within the Nazi state, and an increasingly desperate need for manpower wherever it could be found. The name itself carried weight in those training camps, a name drawn not from mythology or ideology, but from history, real history, reaching back 4 centuries to a man whose legend had never quite faded from the German memory. Georg von Frundsberg. To speak his name was to invoke something that felt almost timeless, almost noble, a counterweight perhaps to the immediate and grinding present of 1943. The choice was deliberate, you might imagine. In those years, as new divisions were being raised and reorganized across the Reich, their names mattered enormously. They were not random designations. They were threads connecting the soldiers to something larger, something that transcended the moment. And Frundsberg reached backward through centuries to touch a figure who had embodied a certain vision of military virtue, of loyalty, of martial skill, that existed in a time when warfare was still understood in terms that felt almost romantic, almost comprehensible. Georg von Frundsberg had lived from 1493 to 1546, and in his lifetime he had become perhaps the most famous Landsknecht commander of the Renaissance. The Landsknechte themselves were mercenary soldiers of the Holy Roman Empire, men who fought with pike and sword, who followed captains rather than abstract states, who built their reputations through victories in Italy, through campaigns in the Rhineland, through service to emperors and princes who valued their ferocity and discipline. Frundsberg was the master of this world. He had raised armies, commanded them with an iron hand, and won battles that were still remembered in the folklore of German-speaking lands. What exactly did this mean to the men who would wear the name on their uniforms in 1943? That is a question worth sitting with, worth letting settle gently into the mind. On one level, the connection was purely symbolic. The division's planners, men in Berlin or Munich or Stuttgart who were thinking about propaganda, about unit cohesion, about creating meaning within the machinery of war, they understood that invoking Frundsberg meant invoking an entire tradition, a tradition of German martial excellence, a tradition that seemed to belong to no particular regime, but rather to German culture itself, stretching backward through centuries. The name implied continuity. It suggested that what these men were doing in 1943 was not something entirely new, not something born from the fervor of the moment, but rather part of a long line of German soldiers who had served with honor and distinction. Whether the soldiers themselves believed this, whether it truly comforted them or motivated them, likely varied from man to man, but the symbolism was there, woven into every order, every uniform marking, every reference to their unit in official communications. There is something almost poignant about this, when you consider it. Even as the Reich was expanding into its most ambitious and most catastrophic campaigns, there remained this backward-looking impulse, this need to root new formations in historical precedent. It was as though the regime understood, at some perhaps unconscious level, that raw ideology alone was not sufficient to bind men together, that soldiers needed to feel they belonged to something with depth, with tradition, with a past that gave meaning to their present. The Landsknecht captain who had died in the 16th century could not possibly have imagined the world his name would be invoked in, or the purposes to which his legacy would be bent. But that is the way of history, is it not? Names travel across time, accumulating meanings, being reinterpreted by each generation that encounters them. Within the division itself, once the men arrived for training at Grafenwöhr and other bases where the Frundsberg personnel were being assembled, the name would have taken on texture and personality through the rituals of military life. Unit insignia featured the name prominently. Officers would speak of Frundsberg's victories, of his tactical innovations, of his reputation for maintaining discipline among men who were by nature wild and difficult to control. The comparison was not subtle. These soldiers too were being asked to be disciplined, to follow orders, to embody a tradition of military excellence. The Landsknecht connection held particular resonance because it spoke to a certain kind of soldier. The Landsknechte had been men who fought for pay and reputation, certainly, but also for the sheer satisfaction of warfare itself, of testing themselves against other men in organized violence. They had a culture, a style, a way of being that was distinct and memorable. They wore distinctive colors and markings. They developed their own songs, their own rituals. In some sense, associating a modern division with this historical legacy was a way of saying to the soldiers, "You are part of a tradition of excellence. You are not merely conscripted cannon fodder, but inheritors of a proud heritage." Whether this actually changed how the men felt, whether it genuinely motivated them beyond the immediate pressures of military discipline and the fear of punishment, is something we cannot know with certainty. But we can observe that such names were taken seriously, that they were repeated in official documents, that they featured in unit histories, that they were invoked in speeches and ceremonies. The regime understood the power of historical reference, the way it could transform a mass of individuals into a unit with identity and purpose. Even in the midst of total war, even as the machinery of destruction was grinding toward its ultimate catastrophe, there remained this attention to symbolism, this creation of meaning through historical resonance. The full designation of the division would be the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, though in the hurried communications and orders of the war years, it was often simply Frundsberg or 10th SS. But that longer title, that formal invocation of the 16th century commander, was there in the official records, present at the founding, present throughout the division's operational history. It was a name meant to carry weight, meant to remind every man who wore it that he stood within a tradition, that his actions reflected not merely on himself, but on a lineage of German soldiers that stretched back centuries. How much of this actually penetrated the consciousness of ordinary soldiers, men who were often conscripted ethnic Germans from Hungary or Romania or other peripheral regions of the Reich, men who may not have known who Georg von Frundsberg was, or cared very much? That is perhaps a secondary question. The name was there. It was official. It was part of the machinery of meaning-making that surrounded military service. And in a war that demanded so much of men, that asked them to endure hardship and fear and moral ambiguity on an unprecedented scale, even small connections to historical precedent, even slender threads of continuity with the past, might have offered some small comfort, some sense that they were part of something larger than the immediate horror of their circumstances. The vast training grounds at Grafenwöhr, in the Upper Bavarian Plateau region near the Bohemian border, began to transform in the early months of 1943 as the infrastructure for something new took quiet shape. This was not dramatic mobilization, but rather the steady, almost administrative process of building a division from constituent parts, a task that would unfold over weeks and months with the rhythmic predictability of bureaucratic machinery. The Reichsführer had decided that the Waffen-SS would expand further, and Grafenwöhr, already a significant military installation with barracks, parade grounds, and the scattered forest clearings necessary for field exercises, became one of several centers where new regiments and supporting formations would be assembled and hammered into cohesion. The first arrivals came in spring, when the snow had only recently receded from the Bavarian highlands, and the ground remained soft and receptive to the thousands of boots that would soon cross it daily. Some of these early arrivals were volunteers, men who had formally requested transfer into the SS Panzer Grenadier ranks, drawn by ideology, by family connections already woven into the organization, or simply by the promise of better equipment and rations that the armored divisions enjoyed, compared to standard Wehrmacht units. These volunteers underwent a different kind of scrutiny, more thorough background investigations into family ancestry and political reliability, though the standards for ethnic acceptability had begun to relax somewhat as the manpower demands of the Eastern Front grew ever more urgent. What had once been stringent racial ideological criteria were increasingly bent to accommodate the practical reality that new divisions required bodies, and ideological purity, while still emphasized, could not entirely supersede the arithmetic of warfare. But the greater portion of the men who arrived at Grafenwehr came through conscription, particularly the so-called ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche from across occupied Europe and the Balkans, men whose German ancestry and linguistic ties made them eligible, in the logic of the regime, for service in the SS rather than in the regular Wehrmacht. Some had been living in Romania, in Hungary, in areas of the Balkans and the Danube basin where German-speaking populations had maintained cultural and linguistic continuity across generations. Others came from territories recently incorporated into the Greater German Reich through conquest or annexation. These men were neither enthusiastic volunteers nor resentful conscripts in the simple sense. Many occupied an uncertain middle ground, aware that refusal or resistance could mean danger to themselves and their families, yet also recognizing that service in a major armored division offered certain material advantages and a kind of social legitimacy that conscription into ordinary infantry units did not. The process of integrating these various ethnic Germans into a cohesive military organization was, one might say, a quiet version of the larger Nazi project itself, the attempt to unify diverse populations under a single ideological and organizational framework, regardless of their origins or prior allegiances. The barracks at Grafenwehr, austere and functional, began to fill with a heterogeneous population that would have surprised anyone expecting a purely ideologically unified force. Yes, there were fanatical SS men, career soldiers from earlier SS divisions, hard-eyed non-commissioned officers who carried the rigorous training standards and the ruthless discipline that had already become embedded in SS culture. But alongside them moved men who were learning German as a second language, who had been living quiet civilian lives only months before, who regarded the rigid structures and endless drilling with a mixture of resignation and bewilderment. How these disparate elements could be forged into a fighting unit was the question that occupied the minds of the divisional commanders as they surveyed the growing population of their training ground. The daily rhythm at Grafenwehr during these formative months was relentless and carefully orchestrated. Reveille came in darkness, and within minutes the men were required to be formed up for morning roll call, standing in the cold Bavarian air, while officers moved along the ranks, checking that uniforms met prescribed standards and that the morning's administrative accounting was complete. Breakfast was sparse but adequate. The SS divisions received better rations than standard Wehrmacht units, and this material difference, though modest, was one of the small privileges that reinforced the sense of belonging to an elite organization. After breakfast came the first of many training blocks: basic drill and movement, the elementary vocabulary of military precision that every soldier, regardless of background, had to internalize until the movements became automatic, requiring no conscious thought. The training grounds themselves stretched across terrain that ranged from open parade fields where entire companies and battalions could be assembled and moved through synchronized maneuvers, to forest clearings where rifle companies practiced small unit tactics and fire discipline. The Grafenwehr installation also included ranges where marksmanship could be systematized and assessed, and gradually, the men who arrived as civilians began to develop the particular kind of awareness that combat training instills, an attentiveness to terrain, to fields of fire, to the spatial arrangements of a landscape as they related to defensive and offensive possibilities. These skills could not be rushed, and the training schedule accounted for this, with weeks devoted to each phase of instruction before moving forward to the next level of complexity. Panzer Grenadier divisions required not only ordinary infantrymen but also specialists, men trained to maintain and operate the armored vehicles that would transport them to battle, mechanics who understood engines and transmission systems, radio operators who could maintain communications across the chaos of advancing or retreating formations. The training at Grafenwehr included instruction in these technical specialties, with some men selected early for intensive courses that would prepare them to keep the machinery of modern warfare operational. These technical men occupied a kind of middle status within the division, neither quite officers nor entirely enlisted soldiers in the traditional sense, but rather skilled technicians upon whom the unit's functioning ultimately depended. The incorporation of ethnic Germans from various regions presented interesting challenges in practical military terms. Language instruction was ongoing for men whose German was imperfect or accented, and officers had to develop methods of communication that could function across linguistic variations. Some units experimented with having ethnic German soldiers work alongside veteran SS men from earlier divisions who could model the expected behaviors and standards. There was an assumption, largely unstated, that the process of military training and the experience of shared hardship would eventually produce loyalty and cohesion, that men who had trained together, suffered together, would fight together effectively regardless of where they had come from or what reservations they might have harbored about the Nazi regime or the war they were being prepared to fight. Whether this assumption held up in practice would only become evident when the division encountered its first real combat. The spring turned to early summer, and Grafenwehr continued its quiet intensification. Divisional headquarters was established, with clerical personnel organizing the endless paperwork that modern military organizations generate. Supply officers inventoried the growing stocks of weapons, ammunition, and equipment that were being allocated to the new division. The question of how fully equipped this division would be remained, however, something of an open matter. The German military-industrial system was under increasing strain from the demands of multiple theaters, the losses of men and material across the Eastern Front were mounting, and the allocation of the best equipment and the newest weapons could not satisfy all competing demands. The 10th SS would be equipped with standard Panzer Grenadier weaponry, the Kar-98 rifles that remained the backbone of German infantry, the MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns that provided the division's organic firepower, Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons for closer range defense against armor. But the question of how much artillery the division would receive, how many of the newer anti-tank guns, whether it would have access to the latest developments in small arms technology, these remained subject to the vagaries of production and allocation that characterized German military logistics in 1943. Within those vast grounds at Grafenwehr, where the forests broke and reformed in geometric lines of cleared earth, the men who would become the Frundsberg Division began their transition from civilians and disparate soldiers into something more cohesive, more uniform, in every sense of the word. The training had momentum now, but it was in these quiet hours between structured drills that the actual texture of garrison life revealed itself, the rhythm that would become, for many of these men, more familiar than the homes they had left behind. Dawn came early to the barracks. The men would wake not to alarms but to the measured tones of buglers, a sound that carried across the camp with surprising gentleness, neither harsh nor urgent in those early months when there was still time to build slowly. The bunks themselves were simple metal frames with straw mattresses arranged in precise rows within dormitory buildings that, while military in their austerity, offered a certain shelter against the German weather. Each man was expected to fold his blanket with mathematical precision before his feet touched the wooden floor, and the inspection of these small details, a blanket corner that fell short by a hand's breadth, became a minor ritual of discipline that meant almost nothing in isolation but accumulated into something larger, a collective training of attention that would matter later when attention meant survival. The uniforms, which arrived in batches throughout the spring and summer of 1943, were themselves a form of social architecture. The cut of the field grey tunic, the placement of insignia, the colour and pattern of collar patches, these were not incidental decorations, but expressions of hierarchy, of unit identity, of the precise taxonomy that military organizations impose upon human beings. A soldier of the Frundsberg would have recognized a fellow divisional member by these markers alone, and perhaps this recognition carried with it a subtle thickening of belonging. The uniforms were made of various qualities depending on supply, some tunics rough and loose-fitting, others with a better finish, but they all transformed the wearer in the same way, subsuming individual identity beneath a visual collective. The men would spend hours cleaning them, using brushes and cloths to remove dust from the seams, pressing their trousers against the sides of their bunks to maintain a crease, small ceremonies of maintenance that occupied the mind while the body rested. Breakfast was served in long halls, where the men sat in their designated sections, eating a dark bread that varied in texture and flavor depending on the flour supply, supplemented with whatever fats and proteins could be allocated. The coffee, if it could be called that, was frequently made from roasted acorns or chicory, a taste that became unremarkable through repetition. After eating, there were always dishes to clean, and this work, the soaping and rinsing of metal plates in large vats of water, created small moments of unexpected quiet within the day's structure. Some men spoke in low voices, others remained silent, and there was, in these periods, a kind of acoustic space where the mind could drift, even as the hands performed their mechanical task. The drills themselves occupied much of the daylight, and here the division's trainers and NCOs imposed a gradually intensifying program. In the early phases, men marched in formations through the camp, learning to move as a synchronized body rather than as individuals. The discipline was firm but, by accounts that survived the war in memoir and testimony, not unusually brutal in these early stages. There was room for minor error, for the gradual correction of posture and rhythm. A soldier stumbling slightly out of step might be corrected verbally, or might be set to extra marching on his own time, but the atmosphere, at least in the accounts we have, was more akin to a demanding teacher than to a regime of terror. That would come later, or in other units, but here, in the camps of 1943, the work was to build competence, to teach men how to move, how to respond to commands, how to inhabit their bodies as soldiers. Rifle instruction began indoors, in lecture spaces, where sergeants demonstrated the disassembly and reassembly of the Kar 98K rifle, the standard issue for most of the men in the division. The weapon was broken down into its component parts, the bolt, the firing pin, the wooden furniture, and reassembled with deliberate slowness, each action explained and then repeated by the recruits. This work had a meditative quality when one considers it from a distance. The repetition, the sensory engagement with metal and wood, the growing familiarity with an object until one's fingers could find their way without conscious thought. Only later, on ranges and in combat, would these practiced motions acquire their darker dimension. In these moments, they were simply the acquisition of a skill, no different in structure from learning a trade in civilian life. The shooting ranges, when men finally arrived at them in the summer months, spread across the open ground at Grafenwöhr, with targets placed at various distances. The sound of rifle fire, that distinctive sharp crack that carries across distance, would have been present continuously on certain days, a soundscape that the men grew accustomed to, though perhaps not comfortable with. The recoil of the rifle, the the smell of cordite in the air, the sensation of aiming down the sight and squeezing the trigger. These were physical experiences that accumulated, building muscle memory and a degree of familiarity with the weapon as a functional object. Accuracy was corrected, stance was adjusted, and slowly the scatter of hits on the target paper tightened into acceptable groupings. Between these structured activities, there existed the texture of ordinary soldier life, the moments that rarely appear in official records, but which constitute the actual experience of being part of an army. Men would sit together during brief rest periods, smoking cigarettes that came as part of the ration allowance, writing letters home to families who waited for news of their sons and husbands. The letters would have been reviewed by officers before posting, read for anything that might indicate low morale or unauthorized information, a quiet intrusion into the private sphere that was simply accepted as the cost of military service. In these letters, we might imagine, men described the weather, the food, their growing familiarity with their unit mates, the small hardships and small comforts that made up their daily reality. Some would have found camaraderie already, bonds forming between men who shared a bunk room or a section in the marching formation. Others remained somewhat apart, processing their conscription or voluntary enlistment with an interior quiet that left few traces. The officers and NCOs who administered this training were themselves a mixture. Some had extensive experience from earlier years of military service, men who had fought in Poland or France and carried themselves with a particular authority born of survival. Others were newly promoted, perhaps younger men who had shown aptitude or political reliability, and who were learning their role as leaders through the very process of training these new recruits. The quality of leadership, by all accounts, varied considerably. Some NCOs earned the respect of their men through competence and a degree of fairness in discipline. Others ruled through intimidation or arbitrary harshness. These differences would follow the men through to their deployment, shaping their experience of warfare and their capacity to survive it. Afternoons, when the intensity of drilling was sometimes reduced, allowed for maintenance work. Equipment needed constant attention. Rifles had to be cleaned and oiled, uniforms repaired, boots treated to keep the leather supple. This work had its own quiet rhythm, the kind of repetitive activity that might occupy 2 or 3 hours without demanding intense concentration. The men would sit in small groups, threading needles and working on torn seams, or sitting in long rows on benches with their rifles across their laps, running oil-soaked cloths through the barrels, along the wooden stocks, over every surface. There was something almost meditative about this work, and perhaps some of the men found in it a kind of peace, a way of being present in a moment that made no demands beyond careful attention. Evenings brought some relaxation. After a meal, which might include a thin soup supplemented with whatever vegetables were available, there was time before lights out. Some men would have attended lectures on hygiene or military history or ideology, lessons that were mandated as part of the education program. Others might have sat in the barracks writing or reading, if reading materials were available. There was a radio in some of the common areas, broadcasting the authorized programs, music interspersed with news bulletins and martial rhetoric, a constant low-level reinforcement of the official narrative of the war. By the summer of 1943, though the optimism of earlier years had faded somewhat, the broadcasts still conveyed a sense of struggle and endurance rather than imminent defeat. The men, many of them, had no way of knowing what was actually happening at the front, no access to the full picture of losses and retreats that their commanders understood. The garrison life, in this sense, existed somewhat apart from the broader reality of the war, a bubble in which the daily rhythms could continue almost independently of the larger catastrophe unfolding to the east. Sundays, when they occurred without scheduled training, sometimes brought a different texture. Military chaplains, both Catholic and Protestant, would conduct services in garrison chapels, drawing men who sought spiritual connection or simply the change of routine. These were quiet moments where the military order relaxed slightly, where men could sing hymns and perhaps feel, for a brief period, connected to something beyond the immediate reality of their conscription or enlistment. Whether these experiences provided comfort or merely highlighted the distance from home is impossible to say with certainty. The interior experiences of individual soldiers remain largely unknowable to us now. As the months passed through that first year at Grafenwehr, the men who comprised the Frundsberg Division gradually achieved a baseline competence. They could march in formation without obvious disorder. They could handle their rifles with reasonable facility. They understood the basic structure of military hierarchy and the expected responses to commands. They had not yet experienced combat, had not yet faced the reality of bullets and shell fire, and the deaths of men they had come to know. The training grounds, for all their discipline and their focus on preparing men for war, remained fundamentally a place of preparation, of rehearsal for something that was still abstract, still theoretical. What awaited them, both in terms of the battles they would fight and the moral complexities they would face, existed still only in the imagination, or in the official rhetoric that filled the lectures and radio broadcasts. For now, garrison life continued its measured rhythm, a slow-motion training for a future that was advancing toward them, whether they recognized it or not. As the ranks of the Frundsberg filled, and the training cycles deepened through that first year, another division was taking shape in nearly identical fashion, not far away, and their paths would become so entwined that history would struggle to separate them. The 9th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Hohenstaufen was being formed almost in parallel, drawing from similar reservoirs of recruits, ethnic Germans, and Wehrmacht transfers, armed with the same equipment shortages and assigned to the same core structure. To understand the Frundsberg, one must understand Hohenstaufen, because these two divisions would come to be known as the twin divisions, a designation born not of deliberate pairing at their inception, but of circumstance, shared commanders, and the terrible symmetry of their battlefield experiences. The naming of Hohenstaufen itself carried deep historical resonance, much like the Frundsberg. Where Frundsberg honored a mercenary captain of the Reformation era, Hohenstaufen drew its identity from the medieval dynasty that had ruled the Holy Roman Empire, a family that represented, in Nazi ideological terms, a golden age of Germanic power and cultural florescence. The Staufen castles still stood in Swabia, their ruins a tangible connection to that imagined past. For the soldiers who wore that name, it was meant to invoke discipline, nobility, a link to something greater than themselves. Whether they felt that connection, or whether such symbolism merely decorated their uniforms, remained a private matter for each man. What made these two divisions truly twins, however, was not their names but their shared organizational structure and, perhaps more significantly, the fact that they would both fall under the same higher command as they moved through their operational lives. They trained in proximity, their officer corps overlapped in certain respects, and when the time came to deploy, they deployed together, often in the same corps, sometimes supporting each other across contested terrain. There was a rhythm to this that became, for historians looking back, almost like watching the same play performed twice, with different casts but remarkably similar outcomes. Consider the strange comfort that might come from serving alongside another unit that had shared your training, understood your equipment's quirks, fought under the same leadership. The men of Frundsberg and Hohenstaufen would have encountered each other in rear areas, perhaps traded supplies or information, formed friendships that crossed divisional boundaries. War creates a peculiar intimacy between units that suffer together, and these two would suffer together extensively before their paths finally diverged in the closing months of 1944. The formation of Hohenstaufen followed a nearly identical timeline to Frundsberg's own crystallization, which itself points to a broader, almost mechanical expansion of the Waffen-SS in that period. Both divisions were raised in response to the same strategic necessities, both equipped with the same shortage of resources, both staffed partly by veterans of earlier campaigns and partly by raw conscripts pulled into service. The fact that they emerged at the same moment, in the same system, under the same ideological framework, suggests how thoroughly the Nazi war machine had industrialized even the process of creating new military formations. There was no mystique to it, no grand commissioning ceremony in the historical record. They simply came into being as the need arose, as arms and men became available, as the machinery of total war ground forward. The relationship between these twin divisions would manifest most clearly during their shared deployment to the Eastern Front. When Frundsberg first saw combat in the rolling territories of Ukraine and southern Russia, Hohenstaufen was often not far behind, sometimes operating in the same theatre, sometimes in different sectors of that vast front, but under similar operational pressures. Both divisions would experience the grinding, attritional warfare that characterized the Eastern Front in 1944, the slow and then accelerating retreat as Soviet forces gathered their strength and began to push westward. Both would suffer casualties far beyond what their replacements could easily cover. Both would see their equipment worn down by the endless movement and the harsh conditions of that theatre. What grew between them, then, was not a formal brotherhood, but something more organic, a shared understanding of what they had endured, a recognition that their fates were bound together by circumstances neither their soldiers nor most of their officers could control. When Hohenstaufen received orders to pull back from one sector, Frundsberg might be ordered to hold or advance. When Frundsberg took heavy losses in a particular engagement, news of it would filter through the corps and reach the ears of Hohenstaufen's command. They were not allies in the modern sense. They were part of the same organization, the same division of labor within a larger military structure, but their experience of the war became increasingly parallel. The most dramatic moment of their twinned existence would come later, during the Western Campaign, when both divisions would find themselves suddenly shifted from the Eastern Front to counter the Normandy invasion. This sudden redeployment would bind them even more tightly together as they traveled westward on the same exhausting rail journeys, arrived in the same theatre almost simultaneously, and then were thrown into the chaos of the Normandy fighting within days of each other. In that crucible, the twin designation would become less a matter of organizational convenience and more a matter of lived reality. They would fight in proximity to one another, reinforce each other's positions, lose men to the same artillery barrages and air attacks, endure the same confusion and desperation as the German forces sought to contain and then push back the Allied invasion. Perhaps there is something about war that naturally creates these twin relationships, these pairings of units that find themselves always acting in concert, always aware of one another's movements and casualties, always to some degree responsible for each other's fates. The men of these divisions might never have fully understood it in those terms, but they would certainly have felt it, would have known that somewhere nearby was another formation of German soldiers wearing a similar uniform, facing the same enemy, operating under the same orders, and gradually being ground down by the same inexorable processes of modern warfare. The symmetry of their experiences would extend, tragically, even to their final fates. Both divisions would be caught in the same devastating encirclements. Both would suffer near annihilation in the closing campaigns. Both would see the bulk of their surviving personnel captured by Soviet or Western Allied forces. The twin designation, which began as a simple matter of administrative coincidence, would come to describe something deeper, a shared tragedy, a mutual experience of being trapped in a system they had not created and could not escape. and of being slowly, then quickly, destroyed by the forces arrayed against that system. The structure that emerged from those mist-laden training grounds was, in many ways, a product of institutional improvisation. The 10th SS Frundsberg Division, like so many Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS formations raised in the spring and summer of 1943, inherited organizational frameworks that had grown organic and somewhat uneven across years of continuous warfare. There was no single blueprint anymore, you see. Each division that came into being carried within it fragments of what had worked before, mixed with fresh adaptations born from desperate necessity. The divisional headquarters would be commanded by Standartenführer Lothar Debes, a career SS officer whose service stretched back into the pre-war years. Debes was not a figure of particular historical drama, no charismatic firebrand, no strategist of legendary cunning, but rather a competent administrator of considerable experience. He held the rank roughly equivalent to a colonel, and it fell to him to weld together an organization of roughly 17,000 men, a figure that would fluctuate almost constantly as replacements arrived and casualties accumulated. His chief of staff, the man responsible for the practical machinery of daily command, was Sturmbannführer Karl Geseler, whose careful attention to supply lines and personnel rosters would prove crucial in the months ahead. These were the invisible architects of the division's capacity to function, to move, to fight. They dealt not in glory but in manifests and requisition forms, in the thousand small decisions that transform raw human material into an instrument of military force. The organizational chart itself followed a pattern established and refined across the Reich's military apparatus. Below the divisional commander sat the regimental structure, typically 2 or 3 regiments of grenadiers, each divided into battalions, each battalion into companies. The 10th SS would field the 19th SS Grenadier Regiment and the 20th SS Grenadier Regiment as its primary combat backbone, supplemented by reconnaissance elements, engineer platoons, and anti-tank squads distributed throughout. Supporting them stood the divisional artillery, commanded by Sturmbannführer Hans Lüdke, a veteran of Russian campaigns who understood intimately the terrible mathematics of modern warfare, the relationship between firepower and survival, between shells expended and ground held or lost. Yet here is where the careful observer might pause and reflect. Despite this apparent completeness on paper, the 10th SS Frundsberg existed in a state of perpetual scarcity. The German war economy in 1943 was not broken, precisely, but it was beginning to strain under contradictions that no amount of organization could resolve. Equipment that should have arrived did not. Vehicles promised in spring were still pending in autumn. The division was authorized to have a certain number of field guns, but the actual deliveries fell consistently short of establishment strength. By early 1944, when the division was deemed ready for deployment, it was operating at perhaps 70 or 80% of its intended combat strength in terms of weaponry. The men were there, or close enough. The trucks, the howitzers, the machine gun ammunition, these were distributed among competing demands across half a continent. Small arms ammunition was comparatively plentiful, at least in 1943. The Kar 98K rifle, still the standard long arm, fired a round that the German manufacturing base could produce in considerable quantity. But heavier support weapons revealed the strain. The 37mm anti-tank gun, which would soon prove woefully inadequate against Soviet armor, nonetheless remained the division's primary anti-tank weapon because nothing better was readily available. The allocation of MG-42 machine guns, the weapon that would define German defensive capability in the months ahead, was generous by comparison to other formations, but still never quite met the theoretical establishment tables. A commander might be authorized to have, say, 12 machine guns per rifle company. He would, in practice, have 9 or 10. That gap, multiplied across the division, created cascading ripples of reduced firepower. The vehicle situation exemplified the deeper problem. A mechanized division requires trucks, not in romantic quantities, but in practical, grinding abundance. Trucks to move supplies, trucks to move ammunition, trucks to displace men rapidly from one position to another when tactical circumstances demanded. The 10th SS Frundsberg was supposed to have a certain motorization establishment, which is to say, it was designed to be partially mobile, capable of mounted movement, but not fully mechanized in the way that elite panzer divisions were, but supposed to have, and actually possessed, had become two different countries by 1943. The division could requisition German trucks, certainly, but these competed with every other formation in the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS. It could also be allocated captured French trucks, Italian vehicles, whatever could be gathered and maintained. This created a maintenance nightmare, spare parts for 6 different vehicle types, each with its own peculiarities, its own weak points. The human element within this organizational framework was itself a matter worth considering. The officer corps consisted partly of SS careerists, men for whom the SS had been a professional pathway across years, and partly of Wehrmacht officers attached or transferred for the sake of military competence. This mixing was common in the Waffen-SS by 1943. The pure SS ideologues still held the senior positions and the prestige, but increasingly, the actual conduct of operations fell to officers selected primarily for their military capability rather than their ideological credentials. Below the officers stood the NCO ranks, the sergeants and senior enlisted men who were the true nervous system of any military unit. Here the division drew from a mix of experienced men rotated from the Eastern Front, men who had learned the terrible lessons of Soviet warfare the hard way, and younger conscripts being trained into the role. The experienced men were invaluable. They knew the cadence of artillery, the sound that meant take cover immediately, the 1,000 small instincts that kept men alive. But they were finite in number. As the war wore on, more and more of the division's corporals and sergeants would be junior men, promoted quickly, carrying the weight of command without the depth of experience their predecessors had possessed. The soldiers who filled the ranks came from several categories, as has been gently noted. There were ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche, drawn from communities across Eastern Europe, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, the Ukraine. These men often spoke German as a second or third language, had been shaped by cultural contexts quite different from the Reich itself, yet were now absorbed into a German military formation. There were also volunteers proper, men who had chosen the SS, though by 1943 the distinction between true volunteers and conscripted men whose choice was more theoretical than real had grown rather murky. And there were those drafted directly, called up through the conscription machinery, who might never have chosen the SS, but found themselves within its ranks nonetheless. What does it mean to speak of the character of such a division, formed from such disparate sources? Perhaps it is safer to speak simply of its function, its structure, its capacity to implement orders. The men within it were individuals with their own histories, but the organization itself was designed to subordinate individual will to collective purpose. Training for these men proceeded through the summer and into the autumn of 1943, at Grafenwöhr and at other facilities scattered through Bavaria and southern Germany. The curriculum was thorough by the standards of the day. Infantry drills, both individual and in small units. Weapons training, how to maintain the rifle, how to feed ammunition into the machine gun in the correct rhythm, how to handle explosives without destroying yourself in the process. Physical conditioning, endless marching, the building of that particular exhaustion that comes from carrying weight across distance under the watchful eye of sergeants. There were lectures on map reading, on radio procedure, on the expected tactics of Soviet forces based on intelligence summaries and the accumulated experience of veterans. There was rifle range practice, where men learned to fire at targets, though nothing quite prepared them for the experience of being fired upon in return. The training was competent and by all accounts thorough, and yet it existed in a strange temporal space. These men were being prepared for modern mechanized warfare amid a state of chronic shortage. They were being trained to operate at full strength in formations that would, when they actually saw combat, operate at perhaps 70% strength. It was a persistent gap between the ideal and the actual, and no amount of training could quite bridge it. One might ask, how aware were these men of the contradictions within which they trained? How deeply did they understand the strain in the German war economy, the creative desperation of their supply system? Some officers certainly understood it clearly. They read the reports, studied the allocation tables, grasped intellectually the fundamental mismatch between the Reich's ambitions and its material capacity. For the ordinary soldier, the awareness likely came in smaller, more immediate ways. The truck that broke down and couldn't be replaced, so the unit walked instead. The promised anti-tank ammunition that didn't arrive in time, creating improvised solutions. The officer who seemed perpetually worried about requests denied. These weren't the grand strategic comprehensions of total war. They were the grimy, textured reality of a military machine running on insufficient fuel. By the time the 10th SS Frundsberg was deemed ready for combat deployment in early 1944, it had thus taken its shape. The organization was sound in structure, adequate in personnel, and perpetually straining against the constraints of inadequate equipment. The commanders were competent if not celebrated. The soldiers had been drilled into functional military units. On paper, it was a respectable formation, a division fit for combat. And yet every person within its chain of command, from Debes downward, carried the knowledge, explicit or intuited, that this was a formation being asked to do more with less, year after year, a machine designed for operations that the Reich could no longer fully sustain. This knowledge, this quiet awareness of insufficient means chasing endless demands, would shape every decision and every moment from this point forward. By the early months of 1944, the situation on the Eastern Front had begun to shift in ways that no longer allowed the German military the luxury of careful planning or measured deployments. The victories of 1941 and 1942 had long since faded into memory. What remained was a grinding, seemingly endless contest of attrition, with Soviet forces growing steadily larger and more mechanized while German reserves dwindled. It was into this landscape that the 10th SS Frundsberg Division, having completed its months of training and reorganization in the German homeland, received its orders to move east. The journey itself took several weeks. The division traveled by rail and motor convoy across the vast distances of Central Europe, passing through regions that had become all too familiar to Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS units, making the same pilgrimage toward the front. The men watched the German countryside give way to the territories occupied since 1941. Poland, parts of the Soviet Union where the front lines had stabilized, at least temporarily. For many of the younger soldiers, this was their first true glimpse of the Eastern Front's landscape, and it carried with it a certain stark quality. The countryside appeared more weathered, more scarred by war than anything they had witnessed in training or garrison life. The destruction was visible in burnt-out villages, in the absence of civilians in many areas, in the sheer emptiness of territories that had been fiercely contested and were still volatile. The division began to assume its positions in the spring of 1944, somewhere in the region of Ukraine, as part of the broader German defensive efforts along the Eastern Front. By this point, the Soviets had already broken through German lines in several sectors. The winter of 1943 into 1944 had seen some of the most catastrophic German defeats of the entire war. The encirclement at Stalingrad, the failure to achieve breakthrough at Kursk, the steady Soviet advance westward. The front line, which at its height in 1942 had stretched deep into the Soviet Union, was now being pushed back toward Poland and the Carpathians. The 10th SS Frundsberg arrived into an environment of defensive warfare, where the emphasis was on holding ground against overwhelming Soviet pressure rather than any prospect of offensive action. The actual circumstances of the division's early engagements remain somewhat shadowed by the nature of historical records. Unlike the detailed documentation that survives for some German units, the Frundsberg's earliest combat operations in Ukraine are recorded in fragments, unit reports that were sometimes lost or destroyed as the war progressed, testimony from survivors that often carries gaps or uncertainties. What does emerge from these sources, however, is a picture of a division that was immediately thrown into demanding circumstances, fighting in terrain that was unfamiliar, against an enemy that possessed superior numbers and increasingly superior equipment as well. The spring of 1944 was a season of constant movement on the Eastern Front. The Soviets were conducting what might be described as a rolling offensive, pushing German forces back sector by sector, not always in a coordinated grand strategic manner, but in a way that maintained relentless pressure. For a newly arrived division like Frundsberg, this meant that stabilized front lines were almost a luxury. Instead, the men found themselves involved in what German soldiers called Rückzugsgefechte, retreat battles. These were engagements fought while in contact with the enemy and in motion, without fixed defensive positions, without time for elaborate preparations. They were exhausting and disorienting, particularly for troops who had trained in the relatively controlled environment of Grafenwöhr and the German garrison system. One can imagine the experience, if one allows the historical record to guide the imagination. A unit receives orders to take up positions in a given sector, usually at a village or along a river line. The men dig trenches and prepare defensive works, though rarely with the thoroughness that training had emphasized. Within days, sometimes within hours, reports come of Soviet movements to the left, to the right, or directly ahead. Reconnaissance patrols probe forward and return with news of advancing enemy columns. Artillery begins to fall. Soviet guns, increasingly numerous and increasingly accurate as Soviet command structures improved. Orders come to pull back to a new line. Equipment must be moved, wounded must be evacuated, and the division shifts to another position, often scarcely better prepared than the one it has just abandoned. The weather of Ukraine in spring, the Rasputitsa, as it was called, added another dimension of difficulty. The roads became seas of mud as snow melted and the first rains came. Motor vehicles bogged down. Supply convoys moved at a crawl if they moved at all. Men who had never before experienced conditions of that magnitude found themselves wading through mud that rose to their knees, digging positions in sodden earth, trying to maintain equipment and weapons in conditions of relentless damp and cold. The landscape itself, so different from what many of the men had known in their training grounds, seemed to resist them. There is a quality to accounts of the Eastern Front that distinguishes them, quite sharply, from descriptions of other theatres of the war. Men who fought there, regardless of their nationality, reported a particular character to the fighting, a scale, an intensity, a sense of absolute commitment by both sides that differed markedly from the Western theatres. The Soviet soldier, particularly by 1944, had become a formidable opponent. The Red Army had learned from its early disasters. Its commanders had evolved in sophistication. Its tactics had become increasingly coordinated, and numerically, the Soviets now enjoyed advantages in almost every dimension: more soldiers, more tanks, more guns, more everything. For a division like Frundsberg, even one that had been well trained and was motivated by the ideological commitments of the Waffen-SS, the reality was one of being progressively worn down. The spring campaign in Ukraine did not see the division suffer the kind of catastrophic losses that some German units experienced during 1944, but it was a learning experience of a particularly harsh kind. The men of Frundsberg discovered that the theoretical knowledge imparted in training did not always translate smoothly to the confusion of actual combat. Units became separated, communications broke down. Officers and non-commissioned officers found that their carefully laid plans often lasted only until the first shot was fired. To paraphrase a famous military observation, junior leaders, the Unteroffiziers and the young Oberfeldwebels, found themselves making decisions with limited information and no time for consultation. Some made good decisions. Some did not. The survivors learned. Those who did not survive could offer no lessons. What emerges most clearly from the fragmentary accounts of this period is a sense of mounting fatigue and confusion. The division was not being decisively defeated in any single battle, but it was being ground down through constant engagement. Casualties accumulated. Replacements arrived, often rushed and undertrained. Equipment wear increased. Morale, initially high among men who had undergone lengthy preparation, began to show signs of strain as the reality of the Eastern Front became tangible and inescapable. There are references in surviving documents to illness, dysentery and other gastrointestinal complaints that swept through units operating in conditions of poor sanitation and inadequate supply. There are mentions of cold injuries, of men's fingers and toes becoming frostbitten despite the weather warming into spring. The human body, it seemed, had its own ways of protesting the demands being placed upon it. The commanders of the division, experienced officers who had served in earlier campaigns, must have recognized the trajectory on which events were moving. The Eastern Front was sliding toward Germany. Soviet forces were not being stopped. They were merely being slowed. Tactical victories became increasingly irrelevant when the strategic situation was one of unrelenting pressure and systematic German retreat. Some of these officers had been through earlier campaigns and had seen the writing on the wall before, in Russia in 1942 and 1943, and yet the war had continued. Perhaps they held to some hope that a stabilized line could be achieved, that German defensive positions could hold. Or perhaps they had simply accepted that their role was to fight as effectively as possible, knowing that the overall outcome was already in some essential sense predetermined. By late spring and early summer of 1944, the 10th SS Frundsberg Division had begun to gain a certain hardness through its combat experiences in Ukraine. It was no longer a purely training ground formation. Its officers and men had looked into the face of Soviet mechanized warfare and had survived, at least in aggregate. The division had not been shattered, had not been surrounded and destroyed. It retained operational coherence and fighting strength. Yet it was a formation that had been worn by constant engagement, that had tasted the bitterness of retreat, and that was beginning to operate in an environment where reserves and reinforcements were becoming increasingly uncertain. The calm and measured world of the training grounds at Grafenwehr seemed very far away indeed. The Eastern Front had its own logic, its own demands, and the Frundsberg was learning that logic step by difficult step. To understand what the 10th SS Frundsberg would encounter in those first months on the Eastern Front, it helps to sit with the larger canvas of what was happening across that vast theatre in 1944. The Eastern Front, by this point in the war, had become something almost unimaginable to those who had not witnessed it directly. It was not a front in the traditional sense anymore, not a neat line drawn on a map with clear positions and predictable movements. Instead, it was a churning, fluid expanse of territory, where armies dissolved and reformed, where supply lines stretched to breaking point, and where the very concept of solid ground seemed to shift beneath commanders' feet. The Russians, having turned the tide at Stalingrad and then Kursk, were now in a state of almost relentless advance. They had begun, in the winter of 1943, to push westward with a momentum that German High Command had not anticipated with such force. One might ask, what had changed? The answer lay not in some single moment of revelation, but in a slow accumulation of industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and a hardening of Soviet tactical doctrine. The Soviet Army of 1944 was not the desperate, faltering force of 1941 and 1942. It was organized, experienced, and backed by an economy that seemed capable of replacing every loss. For every German tank destroyed, it seemed, 3 Soviet machines would appear across the next ridge. The landscape itself became a character in this narrative. The Eastern Front sprawled across steppes and forests, across the flat plains of Ukraine and the more broken terrain of Poland and the Baltic regions. The distances were stupefying. A soldier might march for days without seeing anything but horizons, and then suddenly find himself in a dense wood where visibility shrank to mere meters. The weather, too, played a role that is difficult to overstate. The Russian winter, that legendary killer of armies, had claimed more German lives than Soviet bullets, and the spring thaw that followed created a landscape of mud so profound that vehicles and horses could barely move. Some German soldiers who fought in the East would later describe those muddy seasons as almost more terrifying than combat itself, because they stripped away all hope of organized retreat or maneuvering. By the spring of 1944, when the 10th SS Frundsberg arrived, the German situation in the East was no longer one of competing for territory or seeking victory. It had become, rather, a matter of managing an orderly withdrawal while preserving as much combat strength as possible. The German army on the Eastern Front had already lost enormous numbers. The casualties were not merely high, they were catastrophic in ways that civilian populations at home could barely comprehend. Entire divisions had been annihilated and reformed, sometimes several times over. The average Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS soldier by this point was either a hardened veteran with perhaps 3 years of combat experience, or he was a fresh conscript, often very young, thrown into a maelstrom with minimal training. What texture did this Eastern Front landscape offer to new arrivals like those in Frundsberg? Imagine arriving at a sector that had seen continuous fighting for weeks or months. The positions would be scarred with shell craters, crisscrossed with trenches that had been dug, abandoned, retaken, and lost again. The forests would bear the marks of artillery, trees splintered or stripped of bark, charred earth where fire had swept through. Bunkers and fortifications would be layered in the landscape, often semi-buried, offering glimpses of how previous occupants had tried to establish some small foothold against an overwhelming tide. There would be evidence of hasty evacuations, abandoned equipment, partially burned documents, sometimes the darker remains of casualties who had not been removed before the unit pulled back. The units already on the Eastern Front, when Frundsberg and other new divisions arrived for their baptism of fire, often looked almost unrecognizable compared to their strength on paper. A company that was supposed to number perhaps 120 men might show up at roll call with 40 or 50 vehicles, would be patched together from spare parts, salvaged from destroyed machines. Ammunition would be tightly rationed. The food supply was unpredictable, sometimes adequate, sometimes consisting of little more than thin soup and bread. And yet, perhaps paradoxically, the men who had survived this long in the East possessed a hard competence that newer soldiers could sense immediately. They moved with an economy of motion. They understood intuitively how to use terrain. They did not waste energy on unnecessary talk or movement. The Soviet forces operating in the same regions were themselves in various states of readiness. The Red Army was not a monolith. Some divisions were among the most effective fighting forces in the world, while others were hastily assembled, poorly trained conscripts thrown into the line to absorb casualties and maintain the momentum of advance. But cumulatively, their advantage was overwhelming. Soviet artillery, in particular, had become a fearsome weapon. Where early in the war German artillery might have had some qualitative advantage, by 1944 the Russians simply deployed more guns and more shells. The experience of being under heavy Russian artillery fire was, by universal account, utterly demoralizing. There was no defense against it except to be somewhere else when it landed. Soldiers who survived such bombardments often emerged psychologically shaken in ways that a soldier might not be after direct combat with infantry. The supply situation for German forces in the East by spring 1944 deserves particular reflection. The war economy of the Third Reich was increasingly strained. Tanks and vehicles were being produced, but not in quantities that could match losses. Fuel was becoming scarcer, which meant that mobility, a crucial advantage for German tactical doctrine, was being sacrificed. Men were being supplied with weapons, but ammunition stocks were carefully watched. Artillery was used more sparingly because shells could not be readily replaced. Winter clothing for the next winter was already a matter of concern, even in spring, because by autumn the supply system might be even more stretched. These were the material constraints within which soldiers like those in Frundsberg would have to operate. There is a question that historians still gently debate. At what point did German commanders on the Eastern Front recognize that the war was unwinnable? Some scholars suggest that by 1944, strategic defeat was already ordained in the eyes of military professionals, even if the political leadership refused to acknowledge it. Others argue that most officers fought with the assumption that something, some new weapon, some political development, some unexpected Soviet collapse, might yet shift the balance. The reality, perhaps, lay somewhere in between. There was a strange duality of consciousness, fighting to win, while simultaneously recognizing the mathematical impossibility of victory. This psychological state, this tension between hope and despair, would have infected the atmosphere into which new divisions arrived. The broader Eastern Front collapse of 1944 was really a series of cascading collapses across a vast space. In the north, the Soviet offensives pushed toward the Baltic and threatened to cut off German Army Group North. In the center, Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, coinciding with the Normandy landings, shattered German Army Group Center so thoroughly that entire corps simply ceased to exist as coherent military organizations. In the south, the advance continued toward Poland and Romania, threatening to outflank German positions across the entire eastern frontier of the Reich. For a soldier posted to any part of this front, the experience would have been one of watching the horizon expand, of learning that neighboring units had been cut off or destroyed, of receiving orders to pull back to new positions that had, in some cases, already been overrun by the time the message arrived. What this meant for the 10th SS Frundsberg, as it was committed to these battles, was that it would never fight in a situation of equilibrium or advantage. It would arrive as a fresh unit, full of men and equipment, into situations where that superiority would be quickly worn away by constant pressure, by material losses, and by the accumulated exhaustion of warfare without respite. The Eastern Front had this characteristic. It did not permit the kind of local victory that might give a soldier the sense of achievement. Any ground gained would likely be surrendered within weeks or months. Any tactical success was always subsumed into the larger reality of strategic defeat. And so the spring and early summer of 1944 saw the Eastern Front not as a stable line, but as a zone of continuous, devastating movement. The great wheel of history turning, grinding slowly, but with an inevitability that must have seemed, to those caught within it, almost supernatural in its persistence. The spring mud of the Ukrainian retreat had barely dried from their boots when the orders came down, sudden and irrevocable, filtering through the chain of command like winter wind through a broken window. It was early June 1944, the very morning when reports of the Normandy landings began to ripple across the Eastern commands, casting a shadow of uncertainty over every decision made in those first confused hours. The men of the 10th SS Frundsberg, still exhausted from months of fighting a losing battle against overwhelming Soviet forces, found themselves wrenched from their positions and told to move west. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a phased redeployment, a desperate, urgent commandeering of available transport, and a march toward the coast that would test their endurance in ways their training had never prepared them for. The journey itself became a kind of purgatory, a long, dusty crossing of a fractured continental landscape where the Third Reich's infrastructure, once a marvel of military logistics, was beginning to crumble like old mortar. Imagine the exhaustion of men who had spent months sleeping in trenches and fighting for every meter of ground, now crammed into railway cars and open trucks, moving westward through the daylight hours, where Allied air superiority made every mile feel exposed and vulnerable. The Luftwaffe, once the guardian of German skies, had all but vanished. Soldiers peered up from their vehicles and saw only enemy fighters, American Mustangs and Thunderbolts, that would swoop down with terrifying speed, their machine guns chewing up roads and convoys with casual, relentless efficiency. What was the practical reality of such a journey? The historical record offers us fragments, but the bones of the story are clear enough. The division moved in waves, never as a complete unit, because there simply weren't enough vehicles and fuel to move everyone together. Some men traveled by rail, crammed into cattle cars that stopped and started with maddening unpredictability, sometimes sitting stationary for hours as guards watched for aircraft. Others marched on foot for stretches, then caught rides when transport became available. Supply lines were stretched impossibly thin. The Quartermaster Corps struggled to feed men who were already undernourished and exhausted, and the shortage of water in some sectors became a minor ordeal unto itself. The psychological weight of the transition must have been profound, though few soldiers bothered to write about such things in letters home. Just days before, they had been fighting in the open steppes of eastern Ukraine, where the enemy was visible and identifiable, and the tactical situation, however grim, was at least comprehensible. Now they were being rushed toward an unknown European shore to face an invasion they had heard rumors about, but could scarcely have imagined in its scope. By early reports, the Allies had put hundreds of thousands of men ashore in Normandy. Entire armies. How many would they face? Where exactly would they be deployed? The questions multiplied with each hour of travel. The weather during those early June days was unseasonably warm in some regions, brutally cold in others. Men suffered from the whiplash of temperature and terrain as they moved through different climate zones. The roads themselves became obstacles, some sections heavily damaged by Allied bombing, forcing convoys to take circuitous routes that added days to journeys that were measured in weeks rather than days. One might reflect on how the very infrastructure that Germany had built to dominate Europe was now becoming a labyrinth that slowed German response to the invasion. The autobahns, the railways, the carefully planned road networks, all of these were being degraded faster than they could be repaired. The division's commander, unfolding maps in the back of a staff car and trying to anticipate where they would be inserted into the desperate situation forming in Normandy, could not have known with certainty what awaited them. The German command structure itself was in chaos. Hitler remained isolated in his East Prussian compound, issuing orders that bore no relation to the actual tactical situation. The Wehrmacht's high command argued about strategy. Panzer reserves were held in reserve based on political considerations rather than military necessity. Into this confusion came the 10th SS Frundsberg, one of many divisions being shuffled like pieces on a board by hands that no longer controlled the game. By the time the leading elements of the division approached the Normandy sector, the beaches had already been consolidated by the Allies. They would not be fighting in the open, on sand and stone, as so many feared. Instead, they would be thrown into the bocage, the dense ancient landscape of Normandy, with its high hedgerows, narrow lanes, and small villages where visibility was measured in meters and armor meant something quite different than it did in the vast spaces of the Eastern Front. The soldiers who had learned to fight in the open now had to learn to fight in a maze. And yet, before they could even arrive at their designated positions, some of the division's forward units encountered their first contacts with Allied forces. The journey west was not a safe passage. It was a gauntlet, and the gauntlet was already beginning to draw blood. Vehicles were strafed, marching columns scattered into hedgerows to avoid fighter bombers. The losses mounted even before the real battle began, draining the division of men and material before it could even fully concentrate to engage the enemy. The duration of the movement, nearly 2 weeks of travel for some elements, longer for others, meant that the Frundsberg arrived in Normandy not as a cohesive whole, but as scattered parts, trickling in day after day. Some historians suggest this fragmentation actually helped the division's survival, as the Allies couldn't destroy it all at once, but the consequence for command and control was severe. Officers didn't know where all their men were, communications broke down, units arrived without their full equipment because some trucks had been lost or destroyed or commandeered for other purposes along the way. The division that would take the field around Caen and the surrounding villages was a shadow of what had been trained at Grafenwöhr, depleted before it had fired a shot in earnest against its new enemy, exhausted in a way that even the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front had not quite managed to achieve. The journey from the Reich to Normandy had been a corridor of dust and exhaustion. When the Frundsberg Division arrived in the Norman bocage in mid-June 1944, the men descended from their trucks into a landscape utterly transformed by war. The Norman countryside, with its narrow lanes bordered by high hedgerows and small stone villages, bore little resemblance to the open steppes they had fought across in Ukraine. Here, terrain itself became an adversary. The hedgerows, the bocage, rose sometimes 8 or 10 feet tall, their roots deep and tangled, their tops dense with leaf and thorn. They divided the land into 1,000 small compartments, each one a potential strong point, each one a place where a handful of determined soldiers could hold back a larger force for hours. The Frundsberg men, arriving with their panzer vehicles and their remaining infantry strength, found themselves in a landscape that would negate the very advantages of armor and mobility that they had relied upon in previous campaigns. The fighting around Caen, that ancient Norman city of grey stone and narrow streets, became the crucible in which the division's remaining cohesion would be tested. Caen itself lay some distance inland from the beaches where the British and Canadian forces had established their initial bridgeheads. The city was not held by the Frundsberg Division initially. It was held by other German units, by Panzer Grenadiers and Wehrmacht infantry, who had dug in through the weeks of late May and early June. But as the British and Canadian forces pushed inland with steady, grinding determination, the Frundsberg Division found itself fed piecemeal into the defensive lines around the city. A company here, a battalion there, thrown into positions that had already been battered by days of fighting, asked to hold ground against opponents who possessed absolute air superiority, abundant artillery, and the knowledge that time was on their side. The attritional nature of the Norman campaign cannot be overstated. This was not a campaign of sweeping maneuvers or dramatic breakthrough. This was a campaign of measured advance, of infantry fighting through hedgerow after hedgerow, of artillery preparation before every movement, of casualties that accumulated day after day. For the Frundsberg men, many of whom had fought in the fluid operations of Ukraine where space and movement could still matter, the Norman blockade must have felt like a kind of strangulation. The tanks that had once ranged freely across open ground found themselves confined to narrow lanes, vulnerable to anti-tank guns, and infantry armed with Panzerfausts hiding behind the next hedge. The infantry, moving through the blockade in small groups, could advance only yards before encountering prepared defensive positions, machine gun nests, or mortar fire. One of the particularly bitter engagements involving Frundsberg units took place in the area of Villers-Bocage, a small Norman village that became the focal point of some of the heaviest fighting in late June. The British had pushed forward with their armoured columns, hoping to outflank the German positions that ringed Caen. The Frundsberg Division, as part of a larger Panzer Corps response, was committed to blocking this advance and, if possible, counter-attacking. The fighting around Villers-Bocage in late June 1944 saw some of the largest tank engagements of the Norman campaign, though by this stage, the Frundsberg Division was operating with fewer tanks than it might have had at full strength. The division had suffered losses en route to Normandy from air attack, and further losses in the initial weeks of fighting meant that it never achieved the striking power that had been hoped for. The grinding nature of the combat wore on the soldiers relentlessly. The warm June weather turned the Norman landscape into a landscape of mud and dust, depending on whether recent rain had fallen. The hedgerows provided concealment, but also concentrated casualties. When artillery or mortars fell on troops compressed into the narrow lanes between hedges, the resulting devastation was often severe. The Frundsberg Division, which had arrived in Normandy with approximately 15,000 men, found its strength eroding through June and into July. Casualties mounted steadily. Replacements, when they arrived, often lacked training and experience. The officers and senior NCOs who had survived earlier campaigns found themselves trying to maintain unit cohesion with men who had never experienced combat before. The psychological toll of this kind of fighting should not be underestimated. In Ukraine, despite the retreats and the grinding losses, there had been periods of relative stability, positions that could be held for weeks at a time, officers and men who learned the terrain and the enemy. In Normandy, nothing was stable. The lines shifted daily, orders changed hourly. Soldiers might be ordered to hold a position, then ordered to retreat, then ordered to counterattack, all within a single day. The air superiority of the Allies meant that German units could move only in darkness or through the densest cover. Daylight brought the danger of being strafed by fighters or bombed by medium bombers. The artillery was omnipresent. It was not dramatic, it was just constant, an endless background of danger that never quite ceased. By mid-July, the Frundsberg Division had been committed to the fighting around Caen for nearly a month. The initial strength had been reduced by perhaps 30% through casualties. The division was rotated back into reserve positions for brief periods of reconstitution, but these periods were never long enough to fully absorb replacements or to conduct proper training. The men were tired. Perhaps this simple fact, the accumulated exhaustion of soldiers who had fought continuously through the spring in Ukraine and who now found themselves fighting again in Normandy, may have mattered more than any tactical or strategic consideration. A soldier who is tired fights with less conviction. A unit composed of tired men is less resilient when casualties occur. The Frundsberg Division, like most German units in Normandy, was being slowly bled to death by attrition, and there seemed no way to stop the process. The Allies could replace losses. They had trained divisions waiting in England. The Germans could not. Every man lost represented a permanent reduction in combat strength that could not be made good. Can one wonder, listening to accounts from soldiers who survived this period, whether they understood at some level that they were fighting in a campaign that could not, in the long run, be won. Did the experienced soldiers, those who had fought in Poland and France and Ukraine, sense that this grinding warfare in the bocage was simply a slower version of the same defeat they had already experienced in principle on the steppes of Russia? The fighting around Köln continued through July. The city itself fell to the Allies on July 9th, but the fighting did not end with the city's capture. The German positions extended south of the city, into the bocage, into the narrow valleys, and along the ridges that defined the Norman landscape. The Frundsberg Division's role in the defense of the positions south of Köln lasted through the remainder of July and into August. Day after day brought the same pattern: artillery preparation by the Allies, advances by British or Canadian infantry, defensive responses by the Frundsberg units, brief counterattacks where local reserves could be committed, followed by another withdrawal to the next hedgerow, the next small village, the next prepared position. The cumulative effect was one of steady, inexorable defeat. The Frundsberg Division was not broken in any single dramatic moment. It was simply worn down, ground to pieces by an opponent who possessed greater resources and greater resilience. Somewhere amid the thunder of artillery and the endless grinding of tracked vehicles across mud and scorched earth, individual men kept writing home. Not all of them. Many had neither the time, nor the will, nor the paper. But those who did sat in whatever shelter they could find: a bunker's corner, the back of a transport truck, a communication trench, and tried to compress their experience into a few dozen lines that might reach their wives, their mothers, their children, sometimes months after they had written them. These letters, when they survive in archives or family collections, reveal something that the casualty figures and the battle maps cannot quite capture. They reveal the texture of exhaustion. A soldier named Klaus, writing from somewhere near Kharkiv in the spring of 1944, described not the glorious struggle for the fatherland, but the simple, grinding fact of being perpetually cold despite the warming season, of the food being simultaneously abundant and tasteless, of sleeping in snatches that never quite added up to real rest. He did not use dramatic language. He wrote as if he were already half asleep, which perhaps he was. The nature of the Eastern Front campaign, especially as it shifted into retreat, created a particular kind of psychological wear that differed from the grinding attrition of static trench warfare. A soldier might be relatively safe one day, holding a defensive line that seemed stable, and then receive orders to move again, and again, and again. The division's commanders made decisions based on overall strategy, but the effect on individual men was a kind of perpetual displacement. Roots could never go down. Exhaustion became not a temporary state, but the baseline condition of existence. What becomes evident from these fragmentary accounts is that fear, while certainly present, often took a second place to a deeper fatigue. Fear is acute and sharpening, but exhaustion is dull and all-encompassing. A man who has not slept properly in weeks, who has been moved from one position to another repeatedly, who has seen too many faces he recognized become quiet, that man begins to feel as if the entire war is simply the way the world is, not an event with a beginning and an end, but the permanent texture of reality. Consider, if you will, the specific circumstances of what is sometimes called defensive retreat. A unit receives orders to withdraw. They gather what they can carry, destroy what they cannot, and move to a new position a few kilometers back. They dig in. They wait. Messages arrive suggesting that the enemy is slower than expected, or that reinforcements are coming, or that perhaps this line can hold. Then new orders arrive. It is time to move again. The psychological effect of this repeated movement, this perpetual compression of hope and its dissolution, works on the mind in ways that are difficult to trace but real nonetheless. Letters from the division, reveal that men began to develop what might be called a kind of resignation. Not surrender, exactly, but an acceptance that the outcome was no longer in their individual hands. One soldier, writing in April 1944, as the division prepared for its sudden redeployment west, expressed a peculiar form of calm. He had stopped worrying about whether Germany would ultimately win or lose. Instead, he had narrowed his concerns to whether he would survive the next month, the next operation, the next movement. This represents a profound psychological shift, a stepping back from ideology and grand strategy to the barest question of personal continuation. At the same time, there remained among many soldiers a kind of stubborn professional pride. The division had been through significant losses. Many of the men who had started the Eastern Front campaign were gone, killed, wounded so severely they could not be returned to the line, or simply missing. But those who remained had developed a certain competence born of repeated survival. They knew how to dig a trench efficiently. They knew how to conserve ammunition. They knew how to move under fire with minimal loss. This professionalism did not erase the exhaustion, but it gave it a structure, a purpose. Even if the larger cause seemed increasingly doubtful, the immediate task of keeping their unit together and keeping their comrades alive remained clear. The letters that mention specific comrades often carry a weight of intimacy that is striking. Men would note that so-and-so had received a package from home, or that another had managed to secure some decent tobacco, or that a third had told a joke that made the whole bunker laugh for the first time in weeks. These small details suggest that personal relationships had become perhaps the primary source of meaning. The division as an institution, the Reich as a political entity, the ideology that had theoretically bound these men together, all of these seemed increasingly distant and abstract. What remained immediate and real was the man next to you, the squad you depended on for your survival, the sergeants who knew your capabilities and did not waste your efforts. There is also, in some of these letters, a creeping awareness of what was being asked of them, and a kind of moral fatigue that accompanied the physical exhaustion. Some men wrote vaguely of things they had seen, things that did not align with the narrative they had been taught about their purpose. They did not always articulate this clearly, constrained as they were by censorship, by doubt, by the simple fact that putting such thoughts into words was dangerous. But there is a weariness in some of these accounts that goes beyond physical tiredness. It is the weariness of holding contradictions, of doing things that seemed wrong while telling themselves those things had to be done. The redeployment from east to west in June 1944, which will occupy the next chapter of this narrative, would have struck many men as a kind of cruel revelation. They had been through the grueling retreat from Ukraine. The division had suffered enormously. There was a sense, expressed in some accounts, that surely now there would be a period of rebuilding, of rest, perhaps of time away from the line. Instead, as the Normandy invasion began and the High Command made its rapid calculations, the order came to move again, to move west, to travel across a continent already turning against them, to arrive exhausted and depleted at a new front where an entirely different enemy waited. One can only imagine the psychological state this induced, though it need not require imagination because soldiers wrote about it. Letters from the journey west describe a kind of numbed acceptance. Events were moving too quickly for fear or hope. Men simply moved because they were ordered to move. They traveled because they were ordered to travel. The personal agency that makes fear and hope possible seemed to have been stripped away, leaving only obedience and exhaustion. What emerges from these human documents, when they are read collectively rather than individually, is a picture of an army beginning to exist in a state of profound psychological dissociation from the larger meanings that supposedly justified its existence. The men of the 10th SS Frundsberg Division were, in this sense, much like soldiers everywhere in the later stages of any long war. They had become machines of adaptation, capable of extraordinary endurance, precisely because they had stopped thinking in terms of grand narratives and focused instead on the immediate, the tactical, the personal. The cost of this adaptation, in terms of moral and psychological integrity, was something that many of these men would carry for the rest of their lives, whether they survived the war or not. The summer of 1944 had narrowed itself down to a single geography, a closing trap with walls of armor and artillery that tightened week by week. By mid-August, the Frundsberg Division, like so many units caught in the great collapse of the Wehrmacht's western position, found itself pushed eastward into the Norman bocage, toward a place that would soon become synonymous with encirclement and desperation, the Falaise Pocket. The word pocket itself, military in its clinical precision, carried within it the weight of inevitability. Pockets, after all, are spaces from which escape becomes progressively more difficult. The division had been pulled into this geography by circumstances larger than any single commander's choice. The American and British advances after the Normandy breakout had accelerated beyond what German high command believed possible. Panzer divisions meant to deliver the counter-offensive that would shatter the beachhead had instead found themselves committed piecemeal to holding deteriorating lines. Frundsberg, worn thin from weeks of fighting, was tasked with rearguard actions and then with attempting to hold a perimeter against encroaching forces pressing from multiple directions simultaneously. This was not, in the historical record, a division fighting from positions of strength or clear tactical advantage. These were soldiers attempting to maintain cohesion while everything around them suggested that cohesion was rapidly becoming a fiction. The pocket itself contracted in August between the towns of Falaise and Argenton, with the Americans pushing from the south and the Canadians and Poles from the north. The Frundsberg troops occupying positions within this shrinking space faced a choice that was not truly a choice at all: hold ground they knew was ultimately indefensible, or attempt to break out through corridors that grew narrower by the day. The records suggest that the division's commanders understood, with varying degrees of clarity, that the situation was untenable. Yet soldiers do not simply dissolve when situations become untenable. They continue to fight, often out of habit, discipline, or the simple inability to imagine alternatives to the orders they have been given. Within the pocket, the division fragmented into smaller units and subunits, each attempting to maintain local security against probing attacks and encircling movements. The terrain in August was hot and dust-choked. Supplies, which had been meager even before the encirclement, became scarcer still. The division's vehicles, already suffering from fuel shortages that had plagued German operations throughout the campaign, were rationed so severely that many units became, in effect, immobilized. This meant that mobility, which had been central to the division's earlier operational doctrine, was stripped away, leaving soldiers to defend static positions against enemies who still possessed superior numbers and firepower. One might wonder how divisions maintain discipline and unit coherence when surrounded on multiple fronts, when supplies are dwindling, and when the broader strategic situation is transparently hopeless to anyone with even a passing knowledge of military affairs. The historical evidence suggests that officers and non-commissioned officers continued to issue orders with an almost mechanical precision. Soldiers continued, in many cases, to obey those orders. The human mind, it seems, has considerable capacity to compartmentalize, to focus on immediate tasks, maintaining a section of trench, organizing a defense of a hedgerow, reporting to a superior, rather than contemplating the larger architecture of collapse. The alternative, a surrender or dissolution of unit command, carried risks that seemed more immediately dangerous than continued resistance. The fighting within the pocket was characterized by what military historians often describe as attritional. This is a word that attempts to describe warfare without narrative arc, without clear advances and retreats, but rather the grinding reduction of strength through constant contact and exchange. The division faced pressure from multiple angles, meaning that defensive positions could not be held in linear fashion, but required depth and flexibility. Yet depth requires space and numbers. The pocket was shrinking, and the division's numbers had already been reduced by weeks of intense combat. This was a geometric problem with a predetermined outcome. As the pocket contracted further, communications between higher command and units in the field became increasingly sporadic and unreliable. Some accounts suggest that divisional headquarters had lost clear understanding of where all of its subordinate elements were positioned. Orders sometimes arrived describing tactical situations that no longer matched ground reality. In such circumstances, company commanders and battalion commanders made decisions with minimal guidance from above, attempting to preserve their units when preservation had become the primary objective. This shift from offense, or even organized defense, to mere survival marked a profound transition in the psychology of the soldiers involved. One might ask whether men who have been trained to attack, conditioned through months of indoctrination to believe in inevitable victory, experience something like vertigo when the ground beneath those assumptions suddenly gives way. The division's movements out of the pocket, or attempts at escape, occurred largely in darkness. Marches conducted at night, units attempting to thread between American and Canadian positions, soldiers carrying only what they could move quickly with, leaving equipment and vehicles behind. These movements were not coordinated at a divisional level, but rather piecemeal, small groups moving independently toward positions that officers believed might still be held. Some groups succeeded in breaking out, others were intercepted. The records are fragmented, reflecting the fragmentation of command and communication that characterized these final days of August 1944. What remains most striking about historical accounts of the Falaise Pocket, particularly regarding the Frundsberg Division's experience within it, is the absence of the dramatic. There were no grand last stands, no speeches before final bayonet charges. Instead, there is a sense of gradual dissolution, of units slowly losing coherence, of soldiers who had fought with considerable skill and determination across months of campaign, finding themselves reduced to small, desperate groups attempting to avoid capture or death. The pocket itself would eventually close almost entirely by August 21st, though small groups of soldiers continued efforts at escape for days afterward. The division, as a cohesive fighting force, ceased to exist in any meaningful sense by the beginning of September. The human cost of the encirclement was substantial. Casualties, captured soldiers, and missing personnel represented a loss of perhaps 30 to 40% of the division's remaining strength. The exact figures remain uncertain in many sources, partly because divisional records from this period were incomplete even at the time, destroyed afterward, or contradicted by different archival collections. What is clear is that the Falaise Pocket represented a point of no return for the 10th SS Frundsberg. The division would be reconstituted, reinforced, and committed to subsequent operations. Yet the soldiers who emerged from the pocket had experienced something that could not be undone. They had lived through the collapse of the entire strategic position in France. They had fought surrounded. They had seen the end arriving with clarity that no propaganda could obscure. The autumn of 1944 arrived with a strange mixture of exhaustion and purpose. The Frundsberg Division, withdrawn from the grinding chaos of Normandy in August, had been hammered into a fraction of its fighting strength. The bocage fields and the hedgerows that had consumed so many of its soldiers lay behind it now. What remained was a core of hardened men, survivors of the breakout from Normandy and the desperate battles around the Seine, men who understood the rhythm of retreat and the strange mathematics of survival in mechanized warfare. to read the casualty figures from June through August was to glimpse something almost beyond comprehension. Thousands reduced to hundreds, entire platoons compressed into squads, and yet somehow, from the wreckage, command structures persisted. The division was ordered back toward the Reich for reconstitution. The gathering points were scattered across the German landscape in late August and into September, at rest camps and assembly areas, places with names that mattered little to the men themselves, depots and villages whose significance lay only in their distance from combat. The unit began the slow, methodical work of rebuilding. Replacements arrived, some of them fresh conscripts, others pulled from rear echelon assignments or drawn from other divisions that were themselves hemorrhaging men. The Soviet offensives in the east had not slowed. The Americans and British were pushing through Belgium, and there was a palpable awareness among the remaining officers that whatever respite Frundsberg might gain would be temporary. You might wonder what occupied the minds of these soldiers in those weeks of reorganization, and the historical record suggests something both mundane and profound. Concern for comrades who had fallen or were missing, the simple exhaustion that came from living in constant expectation of orders, and beneath it all, the dimming certainty that Germany could win this war. The division was receiving new equipment, assault guns, replacements for vehicles lost in Normandy, ammunition, fuel. The machinery of German logistics, despite the strain of fighting a two-front war, still functioned with a precision that would not entirely falter until late 1945. By early September, the Frundsberg Division had not yet fully regenerated, but it had become something functional again, perhaps 40 or 50% of its Normandy strength, but with enough organization and combat experience to be deployable. The High Command, in its assessment of the military situation along the Northern European front, saw what appeared to be an extraordinary opportunity. The British forces under Montgomery had advanced rapidly from Normandy through France and into Belgium. There was, in some German strategic circles, a moment of possibility that seemed to emerge from the chaos of late summer. What if a concentrated German counteroffensive, launched northward toward the coast and toward the rear of the British advance, could disrupt or even sever the supply lines supporting the Allied push into the Netherlands? This thinking, tinged with what historians have sometimes called wishful optimism, led to planning for what would become known as Operation Market Garden from the Allied perspective, though the Frundsberg Division would experience it from an entirely different vantage point. The orders came in the first week of September, and they contained something unexpected. Frundsberg was not being assigned to some defensive posture in a sector of the Reich. Instead, it was being moved north, toward the Netherlands, to an area around the city of Arnhem. The movement was rapid and exhausting. Trucks and rail transport carried the division northward across the German landscape, through cities where the bombing campaigns had left their terrible marks, past civilians who watched from bombed-out windows with expressions that no longer registered surprise at the passage of military convoys. The soldiers themselves had little detailed knowledge of what awaited them. Orders in the Wehrmacht were often compartmentalized, and lower-ranking men knew only what they needed to know to execute their immediate assignments. But the officers and the non-commissioned officers understood something of the strategic picture. This movement northward was not part of a general retreat. They were being sent to hold something, to defend something that was deemed important enough to warrant the commitment of a depleted Waffen-SS division. The Netherlands in early September was a landscape in flux. The German occupation had lasted 4 years, and the Dutch civilian population had endured those years with a complex mixture of resistance, collaboration, and survival. The northern coast and the airspace above the low, water-threaded countryside had become increasingly contested. German defences had been constructed along what was called the Scheldt estuary and inland toward the eastern provinces, but these defences were thin, stretched across vast territories, and held by garrison troops that were not of the same caliber as frontline combat formations. The Frundsberg Division, when it arrived and took up positions in the Arnhem region, represented a significant concentration of combat power, perhaps the most formidable field formation in that particular sector. What happened next would become one of the most studied episodes of the entire European campaign, not because Frundsberg played a dominant role in determining its outcome, but because the division found itself directly engaged in what became the Battle of Arnhem. Operation Market Garden, launched by the Allies on September 17, 1944, was a bold and intricate plan. Allied airborne forces, British, American, and Polish units, would be dropped behind German lines in a coordinated series of landings intended to seize key bridges across the Dutch waterways and enable a rapid northward advance that would outflank German defences and potentially open a route toward the Rhine. The plan was elegant in its conception and almost impossibly complex in its execution. For the soldiers of Frundsberg, the operation's beginning came not as a warning, but as an eruption. The skies above the Netherlands on that autumn morning filled with aircraft, transport planes towing gliders, bombers, and fighter escorts, and from those aircraft descended thousands of British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Corps. The division's soldiers, in their scattered positions and defensive lines around Arnhem, suddenly found themselves confronted with something they had not anticipated: an enemy force appearing seemingly from the heavens, landing behind their positions, and beginning to organize into combat groups. The initial shock gave way to recognition among the German officers of what was happening. The Frundsberg Division's command structure, which had been settling into a relatively quiet occupation role, rapidly shifted into combat posture. Here was something reminiscent of the kind of mobile warfare that had characterized the fighting in Normandy, except that this time the Frundsberg soldiers were not entirely on the back foot. The division held prepared positions, had armor and artillery, and could move to concentrate forces more rapidly than the scattered British paratroopers could reorganize themselves. There is something almost paradoxical in the position that Frundsberg found itself occupying. A unit that had been battered and depleted by 2 months of brutal fighting suddenly found itself holding defensive high ground against troops who, while well-trained and determined, were in the midst of organizing themselves into a coherent fighting force. The officers of Frundsberg, men like their regimental commanders and battalion-level leaders who had survived the Normandy ordeal, began to execute a strategy of containment and counterattack. They would attempt to prevent the British airborne from breaking out from their landing zones, to hold the key points that the Allies were targeting, and to inflict maximum casualties on the invaders while themselves preserving their limited strength. The question that emerged, almost unspoken but deeply present in every decision made, was whether a depleted Waffen-SS division could hold against an entire airborne corps supported by Allied air superiority and the promise of ground forces advancing rapidly from the south. By the time the remnants of the 10th SS Frundsberg Division were reassigned northward in early September, following their bitter experience in Normandy, the German High Command was grasping at an increasingly thin thread of strategic coherence. They had been rotating through various defensive sectors along the borders of the Reich, worn and depleted, when orders arrived for yet another deployment. This time, they would be sent to the Netherlands, to the region surrounding the city of Arnhem, where Allied thinking was about to collide with German desperation in ways neither side could have fully anticipated. The operation that would become known as Market Garden was, in its conception, a breathtakingly ambitious plan. The Allies, riding a wave of momentum from the successful breaking out of Normandy, had begun to believe that the war in Europe might be concluded by autumn. General Bernard Montgomery envisioned an enormous airborne assault. 3 divisions dropped or glide-landed deep behind German lines, aimed at securing a corridor through the Netherlands toward the Rhine and beyond. It was meant to be a lightning stroke, a way to turn the German flank and perhaps even outpace the Soviet advances into Eastern Europe. On September 17th, as dawn broke over the flat, reedy Dutch landscape, thousands of Allied parachutes blossomed across the sky near Arnhem. The British 1st Airborne Division, the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, and supporting Polish units descended into what they believed would be relatively light opposition. The 10th SS Frundsberg Division, commanded at this point by SS Obersturmbannführer Heinz Harmel, happened to be in the precise area where the British would land. It was almost, one might say, a catastrophic coincidence for the Allies. Harmel, a professional career soldier who had survived the Russian front and the chaos of Normandy, recognized immediately what had happened. Where other German commanders might have panicked or delayed, Harmel mobilized his men with remarkable speed and clarity. His division, though still recovering from its losses, was approximately 8,000 strong at this moment. It was not a fresh, fully equipped formation, but it was hardened, coherent, and present. What followed over the next 10 days was a grinding, incremental struggle that unfolded across the flat terrain northwest of Arnhem, particularly around the towns of Oosterbeek and Wolfhaze. The British airborne troops, lightly armed and without the heavy armour or artillery that mobile divisions possessed, found themselves facing a foe that could move, concentrate, and counterattack. The initial German response was confused and fragmented, precisely what the British had hoped for. But as daylight progressed on that first day and German units began to coordinate, the tempo accelerated. One might pause here and consider what running into prepared, mobile opposition must have felt like for the British paratroopers. They had been trained to hold ground for short periods while relief forces broke through to them. They had expected that relief within days. But the ground they held was becoming not a temporary perimeter, but an ever-shrinking island of resistance, because the German defences to the south were far more solid than the Allies had believed. The 10th SS, along with various Wehrmacht units in the area, began to establish a tightening cordon around the British positions. Harmel's tactics were measured and attritional rather than recklessly aggressive. He pushed forward methodically, bringing up whatever tanks, anti-tank guns and infantry he could muster, wearing down the British through relentless local attacks rather than trying to achieve a knockout blow. The terrain itself, crisscrossed with dikes, waterways and villages, favoured a determined defence. The British found themselves unable to manoeuvre widely, and their lack of heavy firepower became increasingly painful. What many listeners might find surprising is that the fighting, though intense and costly, was conducted by both sides with a certain professional restraint. The 10th SS Frundsberg had officers and men who, despite the corruption of the regime they served, maintained standards of military discipline. There were instances of brutality, as there were in nearly all combat operations, but the narrative of fanatical SS fanatics throwing themselves mindlessly at the British does not quite match the historical record. Harmel himself was careful, deliberate, and focused on achieving his tactical objectives with minimum waste. The British airborne, for their part, fought with remarkable tenacity. They dug in at Oosterbeek, a small residential suburb that became their final fortress. They rationed ammunition they knew was running low. They organized their men in the gardens and houses and streets of a civilian town that was gradually being pulverized around them. The weather, which had been clear on the 17th, deteriorated over the following days, making it harder for the Allies to land additional supplies by aircraft. Resupply canisters drifted into German-held territory or were lost entirely. The psychological burden on the British troops must have been extraordinary. They could hear the sounds of German armour moving around them. They saw more and more enemy troops appearing each day. They understood that the relief column pushing up from the south, the British 30th Corps under General Montgomery's command, was not advancing as quickly as planned. The Germans further south were proving far more resilient than anticipated. Slowly, the realization crept through the British perimeter that they might not be relieved, that this might not be a 7-day operation, but something far more desperate. Harmel, observing the tightening noose he was drawing around the British, began to see an opportunity for something more than mere containment. If the British airborne could be defeated entirely without relief from the south, it would be a major propaganda victory for Germany, at a moment when victories had become vanishingly rare. He concentrated his forces, accepting casualties, grinding down the British position day by day. Consider, for a moment, what a soldier on either side of this struggle must have experienced. The constant noise of small arms fire and artillery, the acrid smell of cordite and dust, the anxiety of not knowing, minute by minute, whether the next moment would bring a sudden German assault or a blessed moment of relative quiet. For the British, there was also the gnawing knowledge that they were cut off, that ammunition was being counted and rationed, that the reinforcements they had been promised were not coming. For the German soldiers, there was a different calculus, a sense perhaps that defending their homeland, however late and desperate such a defense might be, was something that demanded commitment. The 10th SS maintained its encirclement through the 20th, 21st, and 22nd of September. The fighting around Oosterbeek intensified as the perimeter shrank. Harmel threw his forces against the British positions repeatedly, probing for weaknesses, following up where breakthroughs seemed possible. The British responded with disciplined fire and determined counterattacks, reclaiming lost ground where they could, holding what they could not reclaim. It was the sort of grim, attritional warfare that tends to blur together in memory, a succession of villages captured and lost, of positions won at terrible cost and abandoned when ammunition ran out. By the 25th of September, it became clear that the British airborne operation had failed in its primary objectives. The narrow corridor that was meant to drive deep into the Netherlands and across the Rhine had never been fully established. The relief forces were bogged down miles to the south. The airborne divisions, particularly the British 1st, had taken casualties approaching 50%. General Roy Urquhart, commanding the 1st Airborne, made the decision to withdraw across the Rhine under cover of darkness, pulling back the remaining paratroopers into a narrow bridgehead on the river's eastern bank. The 10th SS Frundsberg, having achieved what might be called a local tactical victory, ceased active offensive operations. They had held their ground, resisted the British assault, and contributed meaningfully to the unravelling of Operation Market Garden. But this victory, one might observe, was a peculiar kind of victory. The Germans had prevented the Allies from breaking through to the Rhine and from capturing the bridges that might have allowed them to drive deeper into the Netherlands. But they had not destroyed the British airborne entirely, nor had they fundamentally altered the strategic situation on the Western Front. The Allies still possessed overwhelming numerical and material superiority. They still held France and Belgium. They were still advancing, albeit more slowly than they had hoped. What remains striking, when one examines the Arnhem operation and the 10th SS's role in it, is how much it reveals about the nature of late-war German resistance. This was not a nation united in fanaticism, throwing itself mindlessly into battle. It was not an army devoid of tactical skill or leadership. Rather, it was units, like the 10th SS Frundsberg, containing capable officers and disciplined soldiers, still capable of concentrating force where necessary, still able to execute coordinated defensive operations. And yet, ultimately, such tactical proficiency was rendered almost meaningless by the overwhelming strategic superiority of the Allies. The 10th SS could hold the line at Arnhem, but they could not hold the line everywhere. They could achieve local successes, but they could not halt the broader retreat that was about to carry them deeper into the Reich itself. As the autumn rains of 1944 gave way to the first hard freezes, the Frundsberg Division found itself retreating northward from the Arnhem bridgehead, its strength now scattered across a collapsing front that stretched from the Dutch coast deep into the German heartland. The men who had survived the grinding campaigns of Normandy and the autumn fighting were no longer the cohesive, well-supplied force that had shipped eastward 2 years before. Many of them were replacements, conscripted into the division's skeletal units to fill gaps left by casualties that mounted faster than they could be meaningfully replaced. The older men, those who had seen the whole arc of the division's existence from training grounds to this retreating nightmare, carried a weariness that sleep could only partially ease. The journey back into German territory was neither swift nor orderly, though it followed a kind of grim logic dictated by the movements of the Allies to the west and the Soviet armies pressing from the east. Supply lines that had already grown thin in autumn now began to fray entirely. Ammunition came in smaller quantities than required for the defensive positions the division was asked to hold. Fuel for vehicles became so scarce that trucks were sometimes cannibalized to keep a handful of half-tracks running. The soldiers received their rations with less regularity now, and the quality of what they received had begun to reflect the desperation of the German war effort itself. Bread that should have been baked fresh came stale and hard. Coffee, when available, was made from acorns and chicory, a pale substitute for the real thing that the men drank without complaint, because complaint had become something of a luxury. The winter quarters that the division attempted to establish across the winter of 44 and into 45 were fragmentary and temporary. Units that might once have held 10 kilometers of front now held stretches twice that length, with perhaps half the men required to do so properly. In the towns and villages where the Frundsberg soldiers were billeted, the local civilian population existed in an increasingly strange relationship with the military. The war had come home in a way that became undeniable as the year turned. Everyone knew, or seemed to know, that Germany was losing. The question was not whether defeat would come, but when and how much suffering would occur before it arrived. Some German civilians offered what hospitality they could to the soldiers. Others withdrew into a kind of resignation, neither helping nor hindering, simply waiting. The winter itself was severe, though perhaps no more so than winters had always been in these regions. Cold has a particular quality when experienced in retreat, when you are moving backward rather than holding ground firmly, when you know that the position you occupy today will likely be abandoned tomorrow or the day after. Many of the soldiers suffered from what military records sometimes called exhaustion, a term that encompassed something much broader than simple tiredness. It included the cumulative effect of months without rest, the psychological strain of consistent defeat, the erosion of the belief that the war could be won, or even that surrender was possible. Some men simply faded, becoming hollow-eyed ghosts in uniform who moved through their duties without apparent volition. The organizational structure of the division itself began to break down in ways that were difficult to arrest or reverse. The officer corps had been badly depleted through the fall campaigns. Some commanders had been killed in action. Others had been rotated to the rear for staff positions or transferred to other units in desperate need of experienced leadership. The non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of unit cohesion were similarly scattered. When replacements arrived, they were often poorly trained, sometimes conscripted from labor battalions or drawn from the Hitler Youth with only weeks of cursory military instruction. The division that had once prided itself on its fighting efficiency was becoming an increasingly ragged collection of fragments held together partly by the mechanisms of military discipline and partly by simple inertia. Ammunition shortages began to bite deeply into any real defensive capability. Machine guns, which had been the backbone of the division's defensive positions throughout its campaigns, could no longer be fired with the frequency and density that made them truly formidable. Tank units, never heavily equipped to begin with, found that fuel and ammunition were competing priorities, and fuel almost always lost that competition. Some Panther and Tiger tanks, formidable machines that represented enormous investments of German industrial capacity, were abandoned simply because there was no fuel to move them and no ammunition to fire them. It is a quiet question, hovering at the edge of historical contemplation. What might have happened had those resources been preserved and concentrated differently? The answer likely belongs to the realm of speculation rather than certain knowledge, but it is a question that haunted German military planners at the time. The weather itself became an adversary as much as the approaching armies. Men suffered from frostbite in positions that were supposed to be temporary, but often became semi-permanent through force of circumstance. Medical supplies were insufficient to treat the volume of cold weather injuries that developed across December and January. In some cases, soldiers with severe frostbite were treated at divisional medical posts and then returned to duty because there was simply nowhere else to send them. The division had no rear area reserves of consequence, no deep logistics network that could absorb casualties and return men to the line after proper recovery. Every casualty, whether from combat, cold, or disease, was a permanent loss to the division's combat strength. It was during this long, cold winter that letters from soldiers of the division, when they could be written and posted at all, began to take on a particular character. References to glory and ideological commitment largely disappeared from private correspondence. What remained were expressions of longing for home, concern about the fate of family members in areas threatened by Allied bombing, and a kind of matter-of-fact documentation of day-to-day suffering. Some men wrote about the cold with a kind of grim black humor. Others simply described the routines of survival without commentary. The letters that survived the war, preserved in family collections or military archives, paint a picture of men who had largely surrendered the grand narratives about their conflict and had retreated into the smaller, more intimate narratives of personal endurance. Communications between divisional headquarters and the field units became increasingly difficult as the winter progressed. Telephone lines were subject to constant disruption from shelling and from weather damage. Radio operators, always in short supply, were themselves casualties like any other soldier. Orders sometimes arrived days late or not at all. Higher command structures, already fragmented and confused by the pace of events, became even more so. The division received orders to hold positions that were sometimes geographically confused or tactically impossible. Commanders at the divisional level, working with incomplete information and shrinking resources, did their best to execute these orders in ways that minimized losses among their men, a task that became increasingly impossible as the weeks wore on. By late January and into February of 1945, the situation had crystallized into something approaching clarity, even if that clarity was terrifying in its implications. The Frundsberg Division, like so many other German military units, was being systematically worn away by a conflict that it could no longer meaningfully influence. The question that seemed to occupy the minds of many of its soldiers, though few would have dared to speak it aloud openly, was not how victory might still be achieved, but rather what form the end would take. Would the division be overrun in place by Soviet or Western forces? Would it manage to retreat toward the imagined safety of the Alpine redoubt that senior leadership spoke of with increasing desperation? Or would surrender come, in whatever form that surrender might assume? These questions hung in the cold air of the winter of 1944 and into 45, unasked and largely unanswerable, as the division continued its slow, grinding retreat into the gathering darkness of the Reich's final chapter. By early 1945, the 10th SS Frundsberg Division had become something rather different from the formation that had trained in Germany 2 years before. The men who remained, and there were far fewer of them now, carried within them the accumulated weight of every campaign, every retreat, every friend left behind in frozen earth or burning rubble. Winter in the East had always been merciless, but this winter was something else entirely. This was the winter of an ending that nobody could quite deny anymore, though some would not admit it aloud. The division found itself in Silesia, that contested region in what is now Poland, where the fighting had become less a matter of grand strategy and more a grinding, almost desperate affair. The Soviet offensives of January 1945 had shattered the German lines across vast stretches of the Eastern Front, and Frundsberg was caught in the slow, agonizing withdrawal that followed. The snow lay thick and unyielding, deeper than memory. The temperatures dropped to levels that made even veteran soldiers question whether they could survive another night in their positions. Some wondered, quietly, whether survival was even the point anymore. They had heard the rumors, many of them. They knew the Russians were coming. They knew what came with the Russians. The fighting in Silesia had a particular character to it, not quite the fluid retreat of 1944, but not the static trench warfare of the Western Front either. It was a series of delaying actions, desperate stands in small towns and defensive lines that were meant to hold only long enough for some larger strategic purpose that nobody in the ranks could quite comprehend anymore. The division would establish a position, hold it for days or weeks, take casualties they could not replace, and then receive orders to fall back again. Each withdrawal meant leaving behind the wounded, or the men too exhausted to march. Each withdrawal meant that the unit cohesion, that had once been the Waffen-SS's great strength, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, coming apart. One might ask, during the quietest hours of this narrative, whether armies collapse from a single catastrophic moment, or whether they dissolve more gradually, like ice breaking from beneath rather than above. In Frundsberg's case, it was very much the latter. By early 1945, the formal command structure was increasingly difficult to maintain. Officers who had survived this long understood that their authority depended partly on orders from above, but increasingly on the personal loyalty of their men, and that loyalty was being tested in ways that transcended the ordinary rigors of warfare. The supply lines had become almost mythical things, spoke of in whispers as though they might materialize if discussed correctly. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Winter uniforms were inadequate, and there was little possibility of replacement. Food was sometimes a matter of chance. A successful raid on a Soviet supply dump, or a town that had been abandoned hastily by the Red Army. Proper medical care had become something men on the front could scarcely imagine. Wounded soldiers were evacuated westward, but everyone understood that westward meant toward Germany, and toward a Germany that was itself collapsing. There was a certain dark irony in the fact that as the physical distance to home shortened, the psychological distance seemed only to grow wider. The division's strength, which had once stood at nearly 20,000 men, had dwindled to perhaps half that number by the new year, and that count included men who were unfit for combat, men recovering from wounds, men kept in supply and administrative roles. The frontline strength, the men actually capable of holding a rifle and moving through snow under fire, was perhaps a third of what it had been in 1943. Officers had to be creative in how they reported these numbers up the chain of command. There is a particular sadness in imagining how these men must have done the arithmetic in their minds, calculating how many days such a force could realistically hold any position against the full weight of the Soviet advance. It was during this period that the formal structure of command began to break down in ways that went beyond the mere shortage of personnel. The Reich's system of officer education and replacement had simply ceased to function with any coherence. When a company commander was killed, and they were killed with some regularity, there might be no trained replacement available. A sergeant would be promoted, a capable private elevated to leadership roles they had never trained for. Some officers, particularly those of the old Wehrmacht tradition, began to disobey orders that they perceived as suicidal or pointless. Not openly, perhaps, but through creative misinterpretation, through reports of conditions that made compliance impossible, through those small, quiet acts of resistance that men in the ranks learned to recognize and respect. The relationship between the SS and the Wehrmacht, never entirely cordial, had become complicated by mutual dependency and shared desperation. The 10th SS Frundsberg, as a Waffen-SS formation, answered nominally to SS command structures, but increasingly found itself under Wehrmacht operational control as the strategic situation deteriorated. This created a kind of administrative confusion that, if one were to imagine it from the perspective of soldiers in the field, must have felt almost absurdist. Orders would arrive that seemed to contradict previous orders. Supply requests would be filled or not filled according to criteria that nobody could quite understand. The clarity of military hierarchy, which had once been one of the German army's great strengths, was beginning to resemble something more like a tangled vine. Perhaps it is worth considering, at this moment in the narrative, what happens to men when the institutions they have served begin visibly to decay. Some soldiers, paradoxically, fought even harder, perhaps in the hope that sufficient sacrifice might somehow change the outcome. Others began to conserve themselves, to take fewer risks, to prioritize survival in increasingly direct ways. A few began to make quiet plans for what came after, if anything came after. This was the world of the Eastern Front in early 1945, a world where hope had been replaced by a grim, exhausted endurance, and where the future had become almost impossible to imagine. The division's movements in February and March 1945 followed the general Soviet advance westward, always a step behind, always retreating through territory that had grown familiar in its desolation. Towns that had been fought over 6 months before were now merely obstacles to be passed through. The snow melted into mud. The roads became impassable in places. Vehicles that had been scarce before became scarcer still as fuel supplies deteriorated. What supplies could not be carried had to be destroyed or abandoned, a bitter necessity for men who had fought so long and so far from home. It was in this period, too, that news from the West began to complicate the division's sense of purpose even further. The Rhine had been crossed. American and British forces were advancing into Germany itself. The possibility that the war might end not in victory, but in the conquest of the homeland, began to shift something in the consciousness of men who had enlisted to defend that homeland. Some soldiers spoke, with cautious indirectness, about the possibility of surrender. Others, particularly the more ideologically committed SS men, spoke of fighting to the last man. But between these extremes existed a much larger group of men simply trying to survive, trying to hold together the fragments of their units, trying to find meaning, or at least dignity, in a situation that offered very little of either. The role of the 10th SS Frundsberg in the final collapse of German forces in the East was paradoxically less visible precisely because it had become a smaller, quieter thing. The division was no longer capable of conducting the kind of operations that would draw historical attention or be remembered in the grand narratives of the war. It was simply one more formation in a vast, disintegrating German army, trying to hold a shrinking line, trying to preserve what remained of itself in the face of overwhelming Soviet strength. By April 1945, as the month began and the war's end approached with the inevitability of a season changing, the 10th SS Frundsberg Division existed more as an idea than as a coherent military force. The command structures that had once defined it, the training and discipline that had once made it formidable, the certainty of purpose that had once driven men forward, all of these had eroded away, worn down not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the slow, patient pressure of an entire war. By the final weeks of April, what remained of the 10th SS Frundsberg Division existed less as a cohesive military force and more as a collection of isolated fragments, each struggling to understand which direction represented survival and which represented oblivion. The collapse of German command structures in the east had become nearly total, with communications severed between field units and higher authority, leaving individual commanders to make decisions that would determine the fates of thousands of men they could no longer adequately feed or supply. The question that haunted every soldier in those closing days was not whether defeat was coming, that certainty had settled into the collective consciousness weeks, perhaps months earlier, but rather how and where it would arrive, and in whose hands they would surrender. The Soviet advance into Silesia continued its grinding momentum through early May, and as the Red Army pressed westward, many surviving elements of Frundsberg found themselves caught between the collapsing German front and the advancing Soviet forces. Some units attempted to withdraw toward the west, toward American and British forces, driven by a fear, often justified by the atrocities they knew had been committed in the east, that surrender to Soviet forces meant something far worse than mere captivity. Other formations, depleted and exhausted, simply halted where they were, waiting for whatever would come next. The roads in those final days filled with an almost surreal mixture of military convoys, civilian refugees fleeing the advancing Russians, and scattered groups of soldiers moving in no clear direction, all of them caught in the same machinery of collapse. On May 7th, just days before the formal German capitulation that would be signed in Reims and Berlin, scattered units of Frundsberg began surrendering to American and Soviet forces in various locations across Central Europe. The surrenders were often quiet, almost anticlimactic affairs. A small group of exhausted men would approach an American checkpoint, hands raised, speaking in low voices that seemed to match the defeated slump of their shoulders. In some cases, commanders deliberately marched their surviving troops toward American lines, hoping to spare them the fate they believed awaited them as Soviet prisoners. Other soldiers, separated from their units, simply surrendered to whoever found them first, whether that was American GIs, British forces, or Soviet troops. The formal end of the division came not with a grand last stand or a dramatic final battle, but rather as a slow dissolution, men peeling away from the unit structure and disappearing into the chaos of the final collapse. The experience of surrender itself varied dramatically depending on where and to whom a soldier surrendered. Those who reached American forces often found themselves treated according to the Geneva Conventions, processed as prisoners of war, given food and water, and eventually transported to prisoner of war camps in France, Germany, or even the United States itself. These camps, while certainly not comfortable, represented something approaching order and relative safety. The men received regular rations, medical attention for the worst of their wounds and illnesses, and the knowledge that they would likely survive the war, though they would do so in captivity. Some of the Frundsberg survivors were processed through the vast American camps at Bad Orb, Mosbach, or other locations, where tens of thousands of German prisoners existed in a strange liminal state. The war was over, but their lives remained suspended, uncertain when or if they would be released to return home. The soldiers who fell into Soviet hands faced a profoundly different circumstances. The Soviet treatment of captured German personnel, particularly those identified as Waffen-SS, ranged from summary execution to brutal captivity. Many of those taken by Soviet forces were transported east into the vast Soviet prisoner of war system, where conditions were nightmarish. Malnutrition, disease, exposure to brutal Siberian winters, and systematic abuse awaited them. How many Frundsberg personnel actually perished in Soviet camps remains unclear, as Soviet record-keeping was inconsistent and sometimes deliberately obscured, but the numbers were certainly in the hundreds, if not higher. Some soldiers, aware of this possibility, deliberately sought out American forces during the final weeks, walking in the opposite direction from where Soviet troops might intercept them, an act of navigation that required courage and luck in equal measure. There exists a particular tragedy in the fate of some Frundsberg soldiers who were initially captured by American forces but later handed over to Soviet authority. Under agreements made between the Allies regarding displaced persons and prisoners, various Soviet citizens captured in German uniform, Cossacks, Ukrainians, and other nationalities who had been forcibly conscripted or had volunteered for German service, were often returned to Soviet control. The term repatriation was used for this process, though many of those returned faced execution or gulag sentences upon arrival. The division included among its ranks a significant number of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, and some of these men faced uncertainty about their status and ultimate destination. Were they German soldiers deserving of standard prisoner treatment, or were they members of conquered ethnic groups who should be repatriated to Soviet authority? The distinction, made in various camp offices and administrative centers far from the soldiers themselves, sometimes determined whether they lived or died. The scattering of Frundsberg personnel happened across multiple countries and multiple months. Some men didn't surrender until weeks after the formal capitulation, either because they were isolated in remote areas or because they deliberately chose to hide and wait for the immediate post-war chaos to settle before revealing themselves. Others attempted to remove their SS tattoos, the blood type marking that identified them as members of the SS, and therefore subject to special scrutiny, using whatever rough methods were available to them in prisoner camps. It was a dangerous procedure, prone to infection, and it often failed to disguise the identity that the Nazi regime had literally branded onto their arms. Interrogators who were looking for Waffen-SS members often knew exactly where to look, and attempting to remove the tattoo sometimes drew attention rather than avoiding it. The officers and senior NCOs of Frundsberg faced additional complications. Those identified as members of the SS faced investigation for potential war crimes and for membership in an organization that the Allies had declared criminal at Nuremberg. Some of the division's commanders were tracked down and eventually tried. Others disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe, using false identities or fleeing to South America or other destinations where, in those early years after the war, it was possible to begin a new life with a new name. The lower-ranking soldiers, particularly conscripts who could demonstrate that they had been forcibly drafted into the division, faced better prospects for eventual release and return to civilian life, though the process was neither quick nor certain. By the middle of 1945, the survivors of the 10th SS Frundsberg Division found themselves distributed across a landscape of prisoner-of-war camps, displaced persons centers, and Soviet gulag systems that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The division that had once existed as an organized military unit, with command structures and supply lines and a shared sense of military purpose, had been reduced to thousands of individual men, each with their own story of capture, each facing their own uncertain future. Some would be released within a year or two of the war's end. Others would spend years in captivity, only returning home in the late 1940s or even the early 1950s. Still others never came home at all. The final scattering of Frundsberg was not glorious or dramatic, but rather a slow, inevitable dispersal into the machinery of post-war occupation, justice, and reconstruction that the Allies had put into place to manage the consequences of German defeat. The decades that followed the division's surrender in 1945 saw something peculiar unfold in the historical record. The 10th SS Frundsberg did not vanish from memory, as one might have expected of a defeated military unit consigned to the ash heap of Nazi Germany. Instead, it entered a curious limbo of scholarship and debate, becoming one of those historically fractured subjects where the simple facts of what occurred seem somehow less settled than one might wish them to be. Historians, both German and Allied, have grappled with how to write about this division, what to emphasize, what to contextualize, and perhaps most importantly, how to narrate the actions of ordinary soldiers caught within an extraordinary apparatus of state violence. In the immediate post-war years, particularly through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the surviving members of Frundsberg began to publish memoirs and recount their experiences to researchers. These accounts emerged from a Germany still learning to reckon with its recent past, from a nation fractured into East and West, each grappling with different narratives of what the war had meant and who bore responsibility for its horrors. The veterans themselves, many of them now civilians returning to civilian life in a radically transformed Europe, carried memories both vivid and selective. Some wrote with apparent candor about the exhaustion and terror of combat. Others seemed to emphasize the technical aspects of their service, the logistics of movement, the tactical decisions made in particular moments of crisis. The question that emerged, quietly but persistently, was this: how reliable were these recollections, and what happened in the gaps between what veterans chose to record and what actually transpired on distant battlefields? A significant portion of the early scholarship focused on the military history angle, the tactical decisions, the movements of forces, the interaction between Frundsberg and other German units during the battles of 1944 and 1945. This approach had certain advantages. It allowed historians to discuss the division's combat record with some degree of empirical precision. One could trace the division's route from the training grounds to the Eastern Front, to Normandy to Arnhem and beyond, cross-referencing these movements with what was known about Allied reconnaissance, intercepted signals, and post-war interviews with German officers. Military history, in this narrower sense, felt more tractable than the larger moral questions that hung over any discussion of the Waffen-SS. And yet those larger questions did not disappear. They simply took on different forms in different contexts. In West Germany, where democratic institutions gradually took root in the 1950s and beyond, there emerged a scholarly community deeply conscious of the need to understand how the Nazi state had functioned, how ordinary institutions had been corrupted or repurposed, and how millions of individuals had participated, knowingly or unknowingly, in the machinery of the regime. The 10th SS Frundsberg became, in some sense, a microcosm through which these larger questions could be examined. Here was a unit raised in the shadow of strategic desperation on the Eastern Front, filled with ethnic Germans from across Europe, commanded by officers who had come through various paths to the Waffen-SS. The question that historians increasingly asked was not merely what the division had done in combat, but what it represented as an institution and as a reflection of the broader German military's entanglement with Nazi ideology and practice. The 1970s and 1980s saw a subtle but important shift. A generation of historians who had not lived through the war began to produce more critical examinations of the Waffen-SS as a whole, moving beyond the sometimes reverential tone that had characterized earlier military histories. Organizations like the Institut für Zeitgeschichte in Munich became centers of rigorous archival work and oral history collection. Researchers began to examine not only what happened on the battlefield, but the internal structure of divisions like Frundsberg, how promotions were made, what ideological training was conducted, how the division's officers responded to orders that might have involved reprisals or other actions in contested moral territory. The division's activities in the East, before its transfer to Normandy, came under particular scrutiny. What had Frundsberg done in Ukraine in 1944? What role, if any, had it played in the broader catastrophe unfolding on the Eastern Front? These questions did not yield easy answers, and the historical record, fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, resisted neat conclusions. The question of how the Waffen-SS as an institution differed from the regular Wehrmacht became central to this later scholarship. For many years, there had been a tendency in post-war Germany to draw a sharp distinction between the Wehrmacht and the SS, portraying the former as a traditional military institution that had somehow been subverted or compromised by Nazi ideology, and the latter as inherently criminal, ideological, and beyond redemption. This binary began to lose credibility as historians examined the evidence more closely. The Wehrmacht's own involvement in atrocities, in racial campaigns, in the implementation of Nazi ideology on the battlefield became increasingly difficult to deny. And yet the Waffen-SS, despite its formal subordination to the state's ideological apparatus and its connection to the SS hierarchy that administered the concentration camp system, was not monolithic in its character or its actions. Individual divisions, regiments, and companies could have quite different records, could have different distributions of true believers, conscripts, and those who found themselves swept into events beyond their control or comprehension. The 10th SS Frundsberg, like many other divisions, existed somewhere in this murky middle ground that the cleaner historical narratives of the 1950s and 1960s had largely glossed over. By the 1990s and into the 21st century, a more granular and comparative approach emerged. Historians began to examine the division alongside other Waffen-SS formations, seeking to understand what made certain units more or less culpable for various crimes, what the actual mechanisms of command and obedience were, and how individual soldiers navigated the moral and practical complexities of serving in such an institution. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the opening of formerly restricted archives, both German and Soviet, provided new documentary evidence. The 10th SS's activities in the East could now be examined with reference to sources that had been unavailable to Western researchers for decades. The picture that emerged was in many ways more complicated and in many ways more morally demanding than earlier accounts had suggested. There were no grand revelations that suddenly explained everything, but rather accumulation of small details, orders, unit records, and testimony that gradually filled in gaps in the historical record. One particularly contested area has been the division's role in the Normandy campaign and its treatment of prisoners of war and civilians. Historians have debated the veracity of certain allegations, the reliability of particular witness accounts, and the extent to which actions by individual soldiers or small groups should be attributed to the division as a whole or treated as the exception rather than the rule. These debates have been productive in some ways, forcing scholars to be more precise about evidence, more careful about claims, and more honest about the limits of what the historical record can actually support. And yet they have also sometimes obscured, rather than clarified, the fundamental question of what a military institution like the 10th SS Frundsberg actually was, not in its official designations and hierarchical charts, but in its lived reality as an organization within which individual choices were made, within which ordinary people participated in extraordinary events. The historiography of the 10th SS Frundsberg also reflects broader patterns in how the Second World War has been remembered and studied in different countries and different eras. In Germany, the division's history has been subsumed into larger narratives about German military culture, the Wehrmacht's relationship to Nazism, and the long process of reckoning with the war's legacy. In English-speaking countries, particularly Britain, there has been somewhat greater focus on the division's role at Arnhem, where it faced British forces and where accounts of the fighting have been shaped by British narrative traditions and British veterans' recollections. In the former Soviet Union, and now Russia, the division's activities on the Eastern Front have been treated as part of the broader narrative of the Great Patriotic War, though they have received somewhat less scholarly attention than the actions of certain other German units. These different national and linguistic traditions have meant that the 10th SS Frundsberg has not been studied as a unified subject, but rather as several overlapping but distinct historical objects, each viewed through particular interpretive lenses and prioritizing different questions. What emerges from this sprawling scholarly landscape is perhaps a sense of the division not as a monolithic entity, but as an institution inhabited by thousands of individuals whose experiences varied widely. Some of the division's soldiers were true believers in Nazi ideology, committed members of the SS apparatus. Others were conscripted men who had no particular ideological commitment and who endured their service with resignation or fatalism. Many fell somewhere between these poles, influenced by their environment and the demands placed upon them, without being either zealots or passive victims. The challenge for historians has been to honor this complexity, without using it as an excuse for moral relativism, to understand the constraints and pressures that shaped the division's history, without thereby absolving it of responsibility for what occurred under its banner. The 10th SS Frundsberg, in this sense, remains a subject that resists easy summary or definitive closure. New documents continue to emerge, new interviews are conducted, and with each addition to the historical record, the picture becomes both slightly clearer and yet somehow more intricate, more shadowed by the recognition of how much remains unknown or unknowable. When the guns fell silent in May of 1945, and the survivors of the Frundsberg Division emerged from the ruins of a defeated nation, the weight of those 2 years seemed to settle permanently into the landscape they were leaving behind. What remained were scattered men, many of them barely older than the division itself had been when it first assembled in those misty training grounds of 1943. They returned to a world that was no longer there, to homes that had been reduced to rubble, or simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Some would spend years in captivity. Others would disappear into the machinery of post-war reconstruction, their service erased or buried beneath decades of deliberate forgetting. In the decades that followed, the history of the Frundsberg Division would be written and rewritten by scholars who approached it from different angles, seeking to understand what it meant, what it represented, and what we might learn by studying it at all. There was perhaps an irony in the fact that a formation designed to demonstrate German martial power and ideological commitment would instead become a subject of careful, methodical study, examined not for its triumphs, but for what its very existence told us about the nature of total war, about how nations mobilize their populations, about how ordinary soldiers find themselves caught in extraordinary circumstances largely beyond their control. The division's history, stripped of propaganda and myth, becomes something quieter and more human. It becomes a record of young men enduring impossible conditions, of command structures fracturing under pressure, of equipment failing and supply lines breaking, of the grinding, exhausting reality of modern warfare that rarely matches the grand narratives written about it afterward. The Frundsberg Division never achieved the mythical status of some of its better-known peers, and perhaps there is something instructive in that very obscurity. It was competent without being exceptional, resilient without being invincible, driven by duty and ideology, and fear in proportions that historians still debate but can never fully quantify. Its soldiers fought across 2 continents, retreated through burning steppes and shattered towns, made defensive stands in farmland and urban ruins, endured bombardment from the air and pressure from all sides. They experienced the full spectrum of modern industrial warfare, and few of them survived it unchanged. Those who did carry with them the simple, undramatic knowledge of what they had lived through, knowledge that tends to settle quietly into memory rather than demanding to be retold. What we know of the Frundsberg Division now comes to us through archival documents, through carefully preserved regimental records, through the testimony of survivors given decades later, when the immediacy of their experience had faded into something approaching historical perspective. The picture that emerges is neither triumphant nor entirely tragic, but rather deeply human in its ordinariness. There were moments of courage and moments of terrible loss. There were decisions made by commanders in conditions of absolute uncertainty. There were soldiers writing home to people they loved, knowing that they might not return, but writing anyway because the need to maintain that connection across distance and danger seemed worth the fragile effort it required. The Eastern Front, where Frundsberg first encountered combat, was itself a realm of such scale and such violence that individual units often seemed to disappear into the vastness of it, their struggles and sacrifices absorbed into the larger catastrophe unfolding across Soviet territory. When the division was pulled away westward in that frantic June of 1944, it entered a different kind of warfare, closer, more tangible, fought in territory that had belonged to different nations and different peoples. The blockade of Normandy pressed in around the soldiers in ways that the open steppes never had. The British and American forces facing them were themselves tired and battered, but methodically supplied and continuously reinforced. The feeling of inevitable pressure, of being slowly worn away while the enemy seemed to renew itself endlessly, must have been deeply demoralizing. And yet the soldiers persisted. They dug in, they counterattacked, they retreated when they had to, sometimes in good order and sometimes in chaos, but always attempting to preserve some fragment of coherent resistance. At Arnhem, when the operation began that should have shattered their entire command structure and ended resistance in the Netherlands entirely, the division's soldiers instead rallied, reorganized, and turned back an airborne assault by one of Europe's finest military forces. Not through grand heroism or brilliant tactical innovation, but through the accumulation of small acts of determination, through officers who found ways to coordinate fragmented units, through soldiers who stood their ground when standing seemed to have become the only thing left to do. By the winter of that year, exhaustion had become the dominant fact of existence. The men were cold in ways that only those who have experienced the cold of a northern European winter can truly understand. Not merely a physical phenomenon, but something that seems to invade consciousness itself, that makes thinking clearly feel like a luxury beyond reach. Rations were diminishing. Ammunition was rationed. The expectation that Germany would somehow win the war had long since evaporated, replaced by a grimmer, simpler question. How much longer could this go on, and would you survive until it ended? It is a question that soldiers throughout history have asked themselves, and it is one that lacks any comfortable answer. What strikes many historians when they examine the history of the Frundsberg Division is not what it did, but what it reveals about the nature of the conflict itself. Here was a division composed largely of men who had been conscripted or pressed into service, many of them ethnic Germans from outside Germany proper, motivated by a combination of patriotism, fear, duty, and ideology in proportions that likely varied from man to man. They were equipped with weapons that ranged from excellent to obsolete, depending on which unit and which year we are discussing. They were commanded by officers of varying capability, some innovative and some rigid, some capable of genuine leadership, and some merely present. They were asked to accomplish tasks that became progressively more impossible as the war continued, and through it all, they endured. The final collapse came not because the Frundsberg Division failed in any dramatic sense, but because the entire German war effort had become unsustainable. The mathematics were implacable. The Allies could replace their losses and reinforce their strength. Germany could not. Every campaign drained men and materiel that could not be replaced. By the spring of 1945, the division was less a coherent formation than a collection of remnants held together by the bonds of shared suffering. and the hope that if they could just hold on a little longer, some kind of resolution might arrive. It did arrive, but not in any form they could have anticipated or desired. As the survivors dispersed into the post-war world, the Frundsberg Division entered the realm of historical memory, where it has remained ever since, studied, discussed, debated, but never quite as famous as its sister division or some of the other formations that captured the attention of post-war chroniclers. Perhaps this is appropriate. The division's true significance lies not in any single battle or strategic outcome, but in what it demonstrates about the experience of war at the unit level, about how large historical forces move through and manifest in the lives of ordinary soldiers, about the ways that ideology, fear, duty, and circumstance combine to shape human behavior under conditions of extreme stress. The men who served in the 10th SS Frundsberg Division carried those years with them for the rest of their lives, whether they spoke about them or remained silent. The division itself has passed into history, where it occupies a quiet but increasingly recognized place in the scholarship of the Second World War. Its story is not one of redemption or revelation, but rather of recognition, the recognition that even in the darkest chapters of history, there are individuals navigating circumstances of almost unimaginable complexity, making decisions based on incomplete information, enduring hardships that seem designed to test the absolute limits of human resilience. To study the Frundsberg Division is to encounter, again and again, the fundamental humanity that persists even within the structures of total war. The fields where the division trained in 1943 have long since returned to their ordinary purposes. The towns where they fought have been rebuilt. The survivors, now few, and growing fewer with each passing year, carry their memories towards silence. The war itself has receded into history, becoming something studied rather than experienced, something that can be examined with the distance and perspective that time affords. And yet the questions that their history raises, about courage and fear, about the nature of duty, about how individuals respond to circumstances beyond their control, those questions remain as present and as urgent as they ever were, waiting patiently in the quiet spaces where we reflect on what it means to be human, even in the midst of catastrophe. As this history settles gently into the past, and the distant sounds of those